I was eating takeout on my couch, halfway through a rerun of some show I'd already seen twice, when my phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but I answered anyway, expecting it to be one of those scam calls about extended car warranties. Hello? For a second, there was nothing. Then a man's voice, low and scratchy, like he'd been chain-smoking for decades, said, "You left something behind." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You left it at the diner," he said, his tone flat, emotionless. "I think you've got the wrong number," I replied. "I haven't been to a diner." He paused for a moment, then said, "Are you sure?" Before I could answer, the call ended. It was odd, but I didn't dwell on it. People dial the wrong number all the time. But later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I found something strange on my kitchen counter. A single white napkin with the name Maggie's Diner stamped on it in faded red ink. I don't know how it got there. I lived alone, and I definitely hadn't been to any diner, let alone one named Maggie's. I tossed it in the trash, feeling a little unsettled but convincing myself it was nothing. The next morning, I woke up to another missed call from the same number. This time, there was a voicemail. I hesitated before pressing play, my thumb hovering over the button. When I finally listened, all I heard was faint breathing and, just before the recording ended, the sound of a door creaking open. Now I was officially creeped out. I blocked the number, figuring that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. That afternoon, while walking home from work, I passed a diner I'd never noticed before. The sign out front read, "Maggie's Diner," in the same faded red script that had been on the napkin. My stomach flipped. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the building. It looked off. The windows were dark, even though the neon, open sign was buzzing faintly in the window. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, like it had been dropped into the middle of my neighborhood by mistake. Without thinking, I stepped inside. The diner was empty. No customers, no staff, just rows of cracked vinyl booths and a long counter with spinning stools. A jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, but no music played. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer. On the counter, I noticed a single cup of coffee, steam still rising from its surface, as if someone had just poured it. Next to the cup was a folded napkin. My hands trembled as I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single word, written in shaky handwriting: "Stay." The air grew colder, and a faint hum filled the room, like an old refrigerator struggling to stay alive. I turned to leave, but the door I'd come through was no longer there. In its place was a blank wall. Panic surged through me. I spun around, searching for another way out, but the windows were gone too. The diner seemed to stretch endlessly now, the booths and tables fading into the distance. "Hello?" I called again, my voice cracking. "Is anyone here?" From somewhere deep within the diner, I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, the sound of heavy boots on the tile floor. I couldn't see where they were coming from, but they were getting closer. I backed up until I hit the counter, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from behind me, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." I spun around, but no one was there. The coffee cup was gone now, replaced by a small, black notebook. I hesitated, then opened it. The pages were filled with names, written in the same shaky handwriting as the napkin. I flipped through, my hands trembling, until I reached the last page. There, in large, bold letters, was my name. I dropped the notebook and stumbled back, my mind racing. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening, and the room started to tilt, the walls bending and warping like a funhouse mirror. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was standing on the sidewalk outside the diner. The sun was shining, people were walking by, and everything looked normal. But when I turned to look at the building, Maggie's Diner was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. I don't know what happened that day, or how I ended up there, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice whispering in the back of my mind. "You shouldn't have come back." The train arrived at 11:58 p.m., exactly as the ticket promised. I stood alone on the dimly lit platform, clutching the flimsy slip of paper, trying to ignore the strange chill in the air. The station was eerily quiet, save for the occasional hiss of steam escaping the train's brakes. The train itself looked ancient, its dark green paint chipped, its windows clouded with years of grime. It didn't even have a logo or a route name, just a number stenciled on the side, 42X. I wasn't sure why I'd bought the ticket. It had appeared in my mailbox 2 days earlier, tucked inside an unmarked envelope. There was no return address, no note, just the ticket with my name neatly printed on it. I almost threw it away, but something about it intrigued me. The departure time, the station. It all seemed to align perfectly, like it was meant for me. So here I was, stepping onto the train without any real destination in mind. The interior was as worn as the outside. Threadbare seats, dim amber lights that flickered intermittently, and an odd smell of damp wood and engine oil. There were only a handful of other passengers, scattered throughout the car, their faces hidden behind newspapers or tilted downward in sleep. No one looked up as I walked down the aisle. I chose a seat near the middle, next to a fogged-up window. The train shuddered and lurched forward, the wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks. Outside, the world was swallowed by darkness, the occasional flicker of a passing light the only indication we were moving. At first, it was oddly soothing, the steady motion, the low hum of the train. It almost lulled me to sleep. But then I noticed something strange. The man sitting 2 rows ahead of me had a suitcase that was leaking. A dark liquid dripped steadily from the corner, pooling onto the floor. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but before I could say anything, the conductor appeared. He was tall and thin, wearing an outdated uniform with gold buttons that glinted in the dim light. "Ticket, please," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I handed over my ticket, and his bony fingers brushed mine as he took it. His touch was ice-cold. He didn't punch the ticket or scan it, just stared at it for a moment before handing it back. "Enjoy the ride," he murmured, moving on to the next passenger. When I looked back at the man with the suitcase, he was gone. The suitcase, too. The floor was dry, as if nothing had been there. I stared at the empty seat, my unease growing. I glanced around the car, but no one else seemed to notice or care. The passengers were eerily still, their faces shadowed, their movements mechanical when they shifted or turned a page. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window, but what I saw wasn't the landscape I expected. There were no trees, no buildings, no sign of the countryside or city lights. Instead, the train seemed to be passing through a fog so thick it swallowed everything. Shapes moved in the mist, tall, spindly figures that seemed to flicker like old film projections. The conductor returned, moving slowly down the aisle. This time, he wasn't asking for tickets. Instead, he stopped at each seat, leaning in close to the passengers, whispering something I couldn't hear. Each person nodded once, then turned to look straight ahead, their faces completely blank. When he reached me, I braced myself. He leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to mine. His breath smelled like burnt paper and something metallic. "Do you know where you're going?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "No. Isn't this train heading to?" "Doesn't matter," he interrupted, straightening up. His eyes, pale and glassy, locked onto mine. "You'll get there soon enough." He moved on without another word, but the air around me felt heavier, like the car itself was pressing inward. I noticed something on the window then, a faint handprint, smeared in the condensation. It wasn't mine. I turned to look at the seat across the aisle. A woman was sitting there now, though I could have sworn it was empty when I boarded. She was dressed in black, her hair long and tangled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was staring straight ahead, not blinking. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. The train jolted suddenly, and the lights flickered off for a moment. When they came back on, the woman was gone. But in her place was a piece of paper, folded neatly on the seat. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and unfolded it to find a single word scrawled in dark, uneven ink. "Remember." The train picked up speed, the wheels screaming against the rails. The fog outside thickened, and the shadows in the mist grew closer, pressing against the glass. I wanted to get off, But when I stood and tried to make my way to the door, the aisle stretched impossibly long, like a tunnel that refused to end. The passengers turned in, one by one, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes glassy and unfocused. They all looked at me, silent and still, their heads tilting in unison like puppets on strings. I stumbled back into my seat, my chest tightening. The conductor appeared again, standing at the far end of the car, his thin silhouette framed by the dim light. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "I want to get off," I managed to say. He shook his head slowly. "The train doesn't stop until you understand." "Understand what?" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the wail of the train. The conductor raised his hand, and the car was plunged into darkness. I felt the floor shift beneath me, the air growing colder, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the platform. The train was gone. The ticket in my hand was blank now. The ink faded to nothing. I turned in circles, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The platform was empty, the station dark and silent, except for the suitcase. It was sitting there, just a few feet away, its surface slick with a dark, viscous liquid. I first noticed something was wrong when the street lamp outside my apartment started blinking in Morse code. It was subtle at first, a flicker here, a pause there. I thought it was just the bulb on its last legs. But as I sat on my couch that evening, staring at the rhythmic flashes bleeding through the blinds, I realized it wasn't random. I dug up an old app on my phone to translate Morse code and pointed it at the window. The message was short. "Do you see them?" I laughed nervously. It had to be a coincidence, a glitch, just a streetlight acting up. But as I watched, the light flashed again, slower this time, as if impatient. "Look." That's when the scraping started. It came from above, faint and intermittent, like nails dragging against wood. I lived on the top floor, so there was nothing above me but the roof. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind or a stray branch. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving just beyond the ceiling. I grabbed a broom and jabbed at the plaster, hoping to scare off whatever was making the noise. The scraping stopped immediately, and for a moment, the silence was worse. I leaned the broom against the wall and turned back toward the couch, but I froze mid-step. The streetlight blinked furiously. My phone translated, "Behind you." I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. The room was empty. My heart hammered in my chest as I checked every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing there. Just my apartment, quiet and still. The street lamp went dark. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with every light in the apartment blazing, clutching a kitchen knife. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started again, this time from the walls. It was faint, like someone dragging their fingers along the inside of the drywall, tracing the perimeter of the room. I pressed my ear to the wall, and for a split second, I thought I heard breathing. The next morning, the street lamp was gone. Not broken, not knocked over, just gone. The pole, the light, the wires, all of it had disappeared overnight, leaving only a faint circle of disturbed dirt where it had once stood. My first instinct was to call someone, but who do you call about a missing street lamp? The city? The power company? The cops? And what would I even say? Hey, so, my streetlight might have been sending me messages before vanishing into thin air? I decided to let it go. Things break. Things get replaced. It was probably normal, I told myself, even though nothing about it felt normal. At work, things were no better. My coworker Jana kept staring at me from across the cubicle farm. Not just the occasional glance, but full-on staring, her head tilted slightly, her eyes unblinking. When I finally worked up the nerve to ask if something was wrong, she didn't answer. She just smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was empty. When I got home that evening, the apartment felt different. The air was heavier, and the light filtering through the blinds had a strange, sickly quality to it. My furniture seemed off, like it had been rearranged and then hastily put back. Even the walls felt closer, like the whole space had shrunk an inch or two overnight. I tried to shake the feeling, but when I went to wash my hands in the bathroom, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My reflection was wrong. It followed my movements, but it was slightly out of sync, a fraction of a second too slow, its head tilting just a bit too far when I tilted mine. I waved my hand in front of my face, and the reflection mirrored it perfectly, but I could see it in its eyes. It wasn't me. I backed out of the bathroom and slammed the door shut, my pulse racing. I told myself it was stress, exhaustion, some kind of waking nightmare, but deep down, I knew better. The street lamp's message burned in my mind. "Dio, you see them?" That night, I barricaded the bathroom door and sat in my bedroom with a flashlight and a baseball bat. Around midnight, the scratching returned, louder and more insistent. It wasn't just the walls this time. It was the floor, the ceiling, the doors. It was everywhere. And then it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard a faint tap 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 coming from the window. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, no way anyone, or anything, could have been outside. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Against my better judgment, I walked to the window and pulled the blinds aside. The street lamp was back, but it wasn't on the street anymore. It was standing directly outside my window, the pole twisted and gnarled like a tree trunk, the light at the top flickering erratically. The Morse code app on my phone buzzed to life on its own, translating the flashes. "It's too late." The tapping grew louder. I glanced down and saw something I'll never forget. A hand, pale and bony, pressed against the glass, its fingers too long, its nails black and sharp. It tapped 3 times before curling into a fist and dragging itself downward, leaving a streak of something dark and wet on the pane. I stumbled back, tripping over the baseball bat. When I looked up again, the window was cracked open, just a sliver, though I hadn't touched it. And then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, coming from somewhere deep within the apartment. "Do you see them?" it whispered, followed by a low, rasping chuckle. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. I didn't stop running until I was 3 blocks away, standing under the glare of a street lamp that didn't flicker, didn't blink, didn't send messages. Just a normal, boring street lamp. I haven't gone back to the apartment since. I moved into a new place, miles away, but sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping at the window. And when I close my eyes, I see the flicker of a street lamp, spelling out messages in the dark. I first noticed something was off the morning I woke up in a room I didn't recognize. The ceiling was too high. The walls painted a shade of pale green that reminded me of hospital corridors. For a split second, I thought I'd been kidnapped, but when I looked around, the furniture was mine. The bed, the nightstand, even the slightly crooked painting of a sunflower my mom had given me. It was all exactly where it should be. Except, it wasn't my room. I got up, heart racing, and opened the door, hoping for answers. What lay beyond wasn't my apartment hallway, but a vast, empty field stretching endlessly under a gray sky. The ground wasn't grass or dirt, but something smooth and dark, like polished stone. In the distance, a single tree rose against the horizon, its branches bare and twisting like veins. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. When I opened it again, I was back in my familiar hallway. My heart pounded as I stepped out, my hand trailing along the wall to steady myself. Had I dreamed the whole thing? Was I losing it? The next few days passed in a fog of unease. My apartment felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The fridge hummed at an odd frequency, the shower water ran just a bit too cold, and the lights flickered in patterns that made my stomach twist. And then, there was the mirror. It started with a subtle shift. I'd glance at my reflection while brushing my teeth, and for just a fraction of a second, it wouldn't move with me. It would blink a moment too late, or tilt its head as though listening to something I couldn't hear. At first, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But then it smiled. I wasn't smiling. I froze, toothpaste dribbling from my mouth, as my reflection stared back at me with a grin too wide, too sharp. I stepped back, my heart hammering, and the reflection stepped forward. "Stop," I whispered. The smile vanished, replaced by a cold, detached expression. My reflection tilted its head and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Then it was gone, back to normal, mirroring my every move. That night, I covered the mirror with a towel. Things only got worse. One afternoon, as I was walking home, I saw someone who looked exactly like me standing across the street. They were wearing the same coat, the same scarf, even carrying the same tote bag. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then they raised a hand and waved. I ran the rest of the way home. By the time I reached my apartment, I was shaking. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and collapsed onto the couch. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I grabbed it, desperate for a distraction. There was a text from an unknown number. "You need to stop noticing." I stared at the screen, dread curling in my stomach. My hands shook as I typed back, "Who is this?" The response came instantly, "You." I threw the phone across the room. The following days were a blur of paranoia. The world around me felt thinner, like the veneer of reality was starting to peel away. Strangers on the subway seemed to glance at me a moment too long. My name appeared in graffiti on a wall I'd never seen before. And sometimes, late at night, I heard whispers coming from behind the mirror, though I'd never dared to uncover it. Then, one night, I woke up to find the door to my bedroom open. I knew I had closed it, locked it, even. My apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge, but the air felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't name. Slowly, I sat up, my eyes darting to the mirror. The towel I draped over it was gone. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My reflection stood there, perfectly still, staring back at me. Its lips didn't move, but I heard its voice in my head, clear as day. "Let me in." I bolted for the door, grabbing my keys and running out into the night. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away as possible. The city felt wrong, warped. The streets were too long, the buildings too tall, and the sky above was the same dull gray as the field I'd seen that morning in the strange room. Eventually, I found myself at the base of a skyscraper I didn't recognize. Its windows were dark, its entrance unmarked. Yet somehow, I knew I was supposed to be there. The door swung open as I approached, and inside was an elevator. The button panel had no numbers, only a single option, down. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the button. Somewhere deep inside me, a voice screamed to turn around, to run, to never look back. But another part of me, the part that had seen my reflection move on its own, that had read text from someone claiming to be me, knew there was no escape. I pressed the button. The elevator plummeted, faster than any normal elevator should, but I felt no fear. No gravity pulling me down, only the faint, rhythmic sound of my heart pounding in my ears. When the doors opened, I wasn't sure if I'd gone anywhere at all. I was back in the endless field, the single, twisted tree standing in the distance. Only now, I wasn't alone. Figures surrounded the tree, their forms flickering like static on an old TV. They had no faces, only smooth expanses of skin where features should have been. Yet somehow, I knew they were watching me. One of them stepped forward, holding something in its outstretched hands. A mirror. The surface rippled like liquid, and as I looked into it, I saw myself, or something wearing my face. "Let me in," it whispered again. But this time, it wasn't a request. It was a command. The figures closed in, and the last thing I remember is the sensation of falling deeper and deeper, until I wasn't sure where I ended and the void began. When I woke up, I was in my apartment again, lying in my bed. Everything looked normal, but the mirror on the wall was gone. Sometimes, though, I catch glimpses of myself in reflections, windows, puddles, even the screen of my phone, and I know it's still there, watching, waiting. And one day, I think I might let it in. I don't remember moving into this apartment. I woke up here 2 weeks ago, in a room that feels both familiar and alien. The furniture looks like mine. The same coffee-stained couch, the same chipped mug I always use, but it's all slightly wrong. The couch is a few shades darker. The mug has a crack that wasn't there before. Even the view from the window is different. A skyline full of jagged towers I don't recognize, glowing faintly in the night like they're alive. At first, I thought it was a dream, or maybe I'd been drugged, kidnapped, and dumped here as part of some twisted experiment. But no one came to explain. And the worst part? My phone works. I can call people, text them, browse the internet, but no one seems to remember me. I called my mom the first night, desperate for answers. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice distant and unfamiliar. "It's me, Aaron, your son." There was a long silence. Then she said, "I don't have a son." The line went dead. I've tried reaching out to friends, coworkers, even old classmates. None of them recognize my number, and when I send pictures of myself, they don't believe it's me. "Nice try," one of them texted back. "But Aaron died years ago." I spent the first week searching for a way out. The building has endless hallways that loop back on themselves, doors that lead to rooms I've never seen before. Empty offices, abandoned nurseries, a kitchen where every cabinet is filled with the same set of mismatched plates. The elevator is the worst. It only goes down. I tried riding it once, hoping it would take me to the lobby or the street. The display screen inside is broken, so I couldn't tell how far I'd gone. The air grew colder the longer I stayed, and when the doors opened, I saw something. It wasn't the lobby. It wasn't even part of the building. It was a vast, empty space, lit by a pale, sourceless light. The floor stretched out endlessly, covered in a fine, powdery dust. And in the distance, just at the edge of visibility, I could see shapes moving, tall, spindly shapes that didn't walk so much as glide. When one of them turned toward me, I slammed the elevator button until the doors closed. I haven't tried the elevator since. The neighbors are strange. There's the man in 3C, who spends hours pacing in the hallway, muttering numbers under his breath. Once, I heard him stop outside my door and whisper, "It's safer in there. For now." And there's the woman in 7A. She has a habit of staring at me when I pass her in the stairwell, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Last night, she knocked on my door and handed me a jar filled with a thick, red liquid. "It helps," she said. I didn't open it. The nights are the hardest. Around midnight, the apartment starts to change. The shadows on the walls grow longer, stretching across the room like claws. The lights flicker, even when I don't touch the switches. And sometimes, if I'm very quiet, I can hear breathing, slow, deep breaths, coming from just behind the bedroom door. Last night, I woke up to find someone sitting at the foot of my bed. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But then it moved, a slight twitch of the head, a shifting of weight. It was a figure, its body indistinct and hazy, like smoke trapped in the shape of a person. It didn't speak. It just sat there, watching me with eyes that weren't there. I don't know how long I stared at it, frozen in terror. But eventually, it leaned forward, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating off its form. Then it said, in a voice like grinding glass, "Stop looking." And just like that, it was gone. This morning, I found a note slipped under my door. The paper was old, brittle, and the handwriting was jagged, almost frantic. "It's not your world. Don't make it your home." I don't know what that means, but I think it's too late. The apartment is shifting. The couch moved 6 inches to the left while I was in the kitchen. The bedroom door opens and closes on its own, even when I lock it. And the view outside is changing. The skyline is different every night now. The glowing towers are twisting, bending into impossible shapes. Last night, I saw one split in half, spilling dark, viscous fluid that evaporated before it hit the ground. And the sky isn't right. The sun doesn't rise here. The clouds are black, shot through with veins of red and gold, like molten metal. And sometimes, if I stare too long, I see things moving up there. Things that don't belong in the sky. I've stopped trying to leave. The building won't let me go, and I'm not sure I want to know what's outside. But the apartment is watching me. I can feel it, the way the walls seem to breathe, the way the air feels heavier every time I sit still for too long. It's like the space itself is alive, waiting for me to let my guard down. And the neighbors? They've stopped pretending. Last night, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, the hallway was full of them. Every tenant in the building, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. When I closed the door, I heard the breathing again. This time, it was louder, closer. I think I'm running out of time. If you're reading this, don't come looking for me. And if you ever wake up in a place that feels familiar but wrong, get out before it learns your name. I wasn't even looking for furniture that day. I was just killing time at an estate sale, the kind advertised with faded cardboard signs tacked to telephone poles. The house was old, practically sagging under the weight of decades of neglect, and the inside was crammed with mismatched antiques, water-stained books, and boxes of knickknacks no one would ever need. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and something sour. And then I saw it, the chair. It was tucked in the corner of a back room, partially hidden by a pile of faded quilts. Simple but elegant. A high-backed wooden chair with a dark, almost black stain, carved with delicate, swirling patterns that caught the light. The seat was upholstered in a deep red fabric that was worn but still striking. It didn't belong in a place like this. Everything else in the house was junk, but the chair was pristine. Perfect. The woman running the sale noticed me looking. She was ancient, her skin paper-thin, her eyes milky. "You've got an eye for the unusual," she said, her voice crackling like dry leaves. "How much?" I asked. She smiled, revealing teeth too white, too sharp. "For you? $20. A bargain." I handed over the cash without a second thought and carried the chair home, already picturing how it would look in my apartment. That night, I set it up in the corner of my living room, under the window. It was beautiful, even better in the warm glow of my floor lamp. I sat in it briefly, just to test it out. The seat was firm but comfortable, the back angled perfectly. It felt right, like it was made for me. I should have left it alone. The first night, nothing happened. But the second night, I woke up to a noise. A faint creaking, like wood bending under pressure. At first, I thought it was the old building settling. But then I realized it was coming from the living room. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, my pulse quickening. The chair was exactly where I'd left it, silhouetted in the dim light filtering through the blinds. Nothing seemed out of place. But as I stood there, staring at it, I felt something I couldn't explain. A heaviness in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. I went back to bed, telling myself it was nothing. The next morning, I found a faint impression on the seat cushion. It looked like someone had been sitting there. I lived alone. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the way the fabric settled, or maybe I'd sat there and forgotten about it. But by the end of the day, the thought had taken root, growing darker and more insistent. That night, I didn't sleep well. The creaking started again, louder this time, and I swore I heard faint footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth in the living room. When I finally worked up the courage to look, the chair was empty. But the impression on the seat was deeper now, unmistakable. Over the next few days, the chair started to change. Subtle at first. The carvings on the wood seemed sharper, the patterns more intricate, almost alive. The red fabric darkened, taking on a deeper, richer hue, like fresh blood, and the air around it grew colder. I stopped sitting in it. I didn't even like being in the same room as it anymore. But no matter where I went in the apartment, I felt it, like it was watching me, waiting for something. One night, I tried to move it into the hallway, thinking I'd leave it there for someone else to take. As soon as I touched it, a sharp pain shot through my hand, like I'd been burned. I yanked my hand back, and there, on the wooden armrest, was the faint outline of a handprint. My handprint. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my bedroom with the door locked, listening to the creaking, the faint groan of the wood, the whispers I was sure I could hear but couldn't make out. The next morning, I found something carved into the back of the chair. Words, jagged and uneven, like they'd been scratched in with a knife. SIT. Stay. Forever. I wanted to destroy it. I grabbed a hammer and swung it at the backrest, but the wood didn't splinter. It didn't even dent. The chair just stood there, solid and unyielding, like it was mocking me. That night, I woke up to find it in my bedroom. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't heard anything. But there it was, sitting in the corner, perfectly positioned so it was facing my bed. The red of the upholstery gleamed faintly in the moonlight, and I swear I saw it pulse, like a heartbeat. I couldn't take it anymore. I called in sick to work the next day and rented a truck. I dragged the chair out of my apartment, ignoring the way the wood felt warm, almost alive, and drove it to the nearest junkyard. The whole way there, I felt like I was being followed. The shadows in the rearview mirror seemed darker, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. At the junkyard, I threw the chair onto a pile of broken furniture and left without looking back. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Until I woke up. The chair was back. It sat in its usual spot in the living room, looking as pristine as the day I'd bought it. The carvings were more elaborate now, the patterns swirling and shifting in the faint light. The red fabric seemed to shimmer, almost wet. On the seat was a single, blackened handprint. I haven't left the apartment since. I can't. The chair won't let me. It's always there, always watching, always whispering. And the worst part? Sometimes, I catch myself sitting in it, without remembering how I got there. And when I try to stand, the wood grips me like a vice. It doesn't hurt. It almost feels comforting. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I moved into the house on Rookwood Street because it was a steal. A charming craftsman with hardwood floors and original fixtures. It was the kind of house people drooled over. The realtor had mentioned, almost as a footnote, that the previous owner had left suddenly. No foul play, no tragedy, just packed up one day and disappeared, leaving behind a fully furnished home. Honestly, it felt like a dream come true. I had just gone through a messy breakup and was desperate for a fresh start. A new house in a quiet neighborhood seemed like the perfect way to begin again. The first night, everything felt perfect. The air in the house was crisp, almost cold, but I figured the heating needed time to kick in. I poured a glass of wine, sat on the creaky porch swing, and watched the neighborhood lights flicker on one by one. It felt peaceful, like I'd finally found a place where I could breathe. But by the second night, something didn't feel right. It started with the hallway light. It was one of those old pull-chain fixtures, the kind you don't see much anymore. I turned it on when I went upstairs to unpack, but when I came back down, it was off. I tugged the chain again, and the light flickered to life. "Wiring must be old," I muttered, brushing it off. An hour later, it was off again. This time, when I pulled the chain, the bulb didn't flicker. It was completely dead. Frustrated, I grabbed a replacement bulb and screwed it in. As I stood on the chair to twist it into place, I glanced down the darkened hallway and froze. A shape, vague and indistinct, stood at the end of the hall. It wasn't a person, not exactly. More like a dense shadow, darker than the darkness around it. I blinked, and it was gone. I climbed off the chair and stood there for a moment, my breath shaky. "You're just tired," I told myself. "It's a new house. You're adjusting." But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence was too deep, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps, padding down the upstairs hallway. I sat up, straining to listen. They stopped outside my bedroom door. My heart hammered in my chest. Slowly, I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but before I could dial anyone, the footsteps continued. Away from the door, back down the hall, and then silence. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. A lingering trace of anxiety from the move, nothing more. I spent the day unpacking, blasting music to drown out my thoughts. That's when I found it. I was sorting through a pile of old newspapers stuffed into one of the kitchen drawers when a photograph slipped free. It was black and white, faded with age, and showed a family standing in front of the house, 2 parents and a little girl. The girl was holding a doll, her head tilted toward the camera in a way that made her face look slightly off. I stared at it, unease prickling my skin. The back of the photo was blank except for a single word scrawled in ink: "Stay." That night, the footsteps came again, but this time they didn't stop. They moved through the house, slow and methodical, like someone pacing from room to room. I stayed in bed, clutching the covers, too terrified to move. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. The house was quiet again, and for a brief, blissful moment, I thought I'd imagined everything. until I went downstairs. The front door was wide open. I stood there, staring at it, trying to piece together what could have happened. I had locked it before bed. I was certain of it. I checked the locks, tested them, and they worked perfectly. That's when I saw the doll. It was sitting on the porch swing, its porcelain face tilted toward the door. It hadn't been there the night before. I backed away, my hands trembling, and closed the door. For the rest of the day, I tried to convince myself it was just a prank. Maybe a neighborhood kid had left it there. But when night fell, the house felt heavier than ever, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I left all the lights on and tried to sleep. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the lights went out. The darkness was immediate and suffocating. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but before I could, the footsteps started again. This time, they were faster, more urgent, moving toward my room. I bolted out of bed and locked the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The footsteps stopped outside the door, followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed my ear against the door. "Stay," a voice whispered from the other side. The next thing I remember is waking up in my car, parked down the street. My phone was dead. My keys were in my lap, and the house loomed in the distance, its windows dark and lifeless. I haven't gone back since. A few days later, I worked up the courage to call the realtor. I needed answers. "Oh, you moved out?" she said, her voice bright and professional. "That's surprising. The house has such a history." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice tight. "Well," she said, hesitating slightly, "it's been vacant for years. The last family who lived there left in a hurry. Never could find out why." "What about the owner before them?" I pressed. "Oh," she said, her tone faltering. "That would be the Rookwoods. They built the house back in 1923. Tragic story, really. Their daughter went missing. They said she just disappeared one night. The family left soon after." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Well," she said, flustered, "you didn't ask." I hung up. I'm staying with a friend now, but I haven't stopped hearing the voice. It comes at night, soft and pleading, no matter where I am. "Stay." It began the night I accidentally took the wrong road home. I'd stayed late at the office, long after everyone else had left. My boss had given me some last-minute assignments, and I wanted to get ahead for once. By the time I walked out to the parking lot, it was dark, the kind of cold, empty dark that presses against your skin. I was too tired to think clearly, so when I missed my usual turn, I figured I'd just cut through the back roads. I knew the area well enough, or so I thought, and the detour seemed harmless. But the farther I drove, the less familiar everything became. The trees lining the road grew denser, their branches twisting together overhead to block out the moonlight. The asphalt narrowed, and the street signs became faded, their letters so worn they might as well have been blank. My GPS lost its signal, and the soft buzz of static from the radio felt louder than it should have been. I started to feel like I wasn't alone, even though there were no other cars on the road. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a patch of fog hanging low over the road. But as my headlights cut through the mist, I realized it wasn't fog at all. It was a figure. A woman, standing perfectly still in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop just a few feet from her. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, staring at me. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her hair hung limp around her shoulders. She was wearing a long, tattered dress that looked like it belonged to another century. But what struck me the most was her eyes. They were dark, impossibly dark, like two empty pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. I rolled down my window, my voice shaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She tilted her head, just slightly, like she was trying to understand me. Then she raised her hand and pointed to something behind me. I turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching into the darkness. When I turned back, the woman was gone. There was no sound, no movement. It was as if she had never been there at all. I wanted to believe I had imagined her. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the shadows had played tricks on me. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just one of those strange, fleeting moments that didn't mean anything. But then I found the photo. It was lying on the passenger seat of my car when I got in to drive to work. A small, black and white photograph, old and faded around the edges. It showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like an old farmhouse. Their clothes were formal, outdated, long dresses, waistcoats, and bowler hats. But the woman in the middle caught my attention. She was staring straight at the camera, her dark eyes piercing, her expression unreadable. It was the same woman I'd seen on the road. My first thought was that someone had broken into my car. But that didn't make sense. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing else had been touched. The doors had been locked when I parked, and I was certain I hadn't left the photo there. I turned the photo over, hoping for some kind of explanation, and saw a single word written in shaky handwriting. Run. That was when the dreams started. Every night, I found myself back on that road, my car creeping through the dark. The woman was always there, standing in the distance, her figure growing clearer as I got closer. But no matter how hard I tried to stop, the car kept moving, dragging me toward her. And every night, I'd wake up just as she reached for the driver's side window, her fingers brushing against the glass. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping. The photo haunted me, its presence a weight I couldn't escape. I tried to throw it away, once in the trash, once in the fireplace, but each time, it reappeared in the same spot on my passenger seat, untouched, unburned. Then, last night, something changed. The dream started the same as always. The road, the trees, the woman waiting in the distance. But this time, when I woke up, she was standing at the foot of my bed. Her hair was wet, dripping onto the floor, and her dress clung to her body like it had just been pulled from a lake. Her empty eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. She pointed to the corner of the room. Slowly, I turned my head. There was a mirror there, an antique one I'd found at a flea market years ago. In its reflection, I saw myself lying in bed. But the woman wasn't in the reflection. Instead, standing where she should have been, was something else. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its face a shifting mass of shadows. It bent down, its head inches from mine, and whispered something I couldn't understand. Then the mirror shattered, and I woke up to find the room empty. Except for the photo. It was lying on my chest, a fresh crack running through the middle. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know what she wants or why she's chosen me, but I can feel her getting closer. And now, no matter where I go, I see her. At the end of the hallway, in the window of a passing car, in the reflection of a store's glass door. Always watching, always waiting. This morning, there was a new photo on the passenger seat of my car. It showed the same woman, but now she was standing outside my house. I think tonight is the night she comes inside. It began with the lights. The ones in my apartment had always been finicky, flickering every so often, buzzing faintly if I left them on too long. Nothing unusual, nothing worth worrying about. But one night, as I was brushing my teeth, the bathroom light clicked off without warning. Not flickered, not dimmed, just off. I paused, my toothbrush still in my mouth, waiting for it to come back on, but it didn't. The apartment was completely dark except for the faint blue glow of my phone charging in the bedroom. I spit out the toothpaste and stumbled toward the hallway, fumbling for the switch. When I flipped it, the light came back on immediately, bright as ever. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror, pale and wide-eyed, toothpaste foam still clinging to my lips. But something was wrong. My reflection wasn't holding a toothbrush. It was holding a glass of water. I froze. My hand was empty. I hadn't even reached for the glass sitting on the counter. Slowly, I raised my arm. The reflection followed. I turned my head. It mirrored me perfectly, except for that glass of water. I leaned closer, my heart pounding, and the reflection smiled. I didn't. I stumbled back, knocking the towel rack off the wall with a clatter. My head hit the door frame, and for a split second, I saw stars. When I looked again, My reflection was normal, wide-eyed, shaken, no glass in sight. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the world felt off. Not wrong, exactly, but like everything had been nudged slightly to the left. My coffee tasted bitter, though I hadn't changed the brand. The usual playlist I listened to on the way to work shuffled the same 5 songs, even though it had over 200. And then there was the man in the gray suit. I noticed him as I was walking to my building, leaning against the lamppost across the street. His suit was impeccable, crisp, clean lines, but his face was hard to pin down, like a sketch someone had started and never finished. I glanced at him once, twice, and then a third time, but he didn't move. He didn't even blink. I made it all the way to the revolving door of my office before looking back again. He was still there, watching. The day unraveled from there. My coworkers kept asking me the same questions: how my weekend was, whether I'd seen the latest movie everyone was raving about. By the 4th or 5th time, I started feeling dizzy, like I was stuck in some sort of loop. "You asked me that already," I told Melanie, the intern, when she popped her head over my cubicle. "What?" "No, I didn't," she replied, tilting her head like a confused puppy. "You're weird today, you know that?" She laughed, but it didn't sound natural. Too high-pitched, too practiced, like someone mimicking laughter without really understanding it. I mumbled something about a headache and left work early. Outside, the man in the gray suit was gone. That night, my apartment betrayed me. I woke up around 3 a.m., the kind of wakefulness that's sharp and immediate, no grogginess at all. The air felt heavier, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Then I heard the hum. It was faint, barely audible, but constant. A low, steady vibration coming from somewhere behind the walls. I followed it to the living room, where I found the television on, showing nothing but static. I hadn't turned it on. I hadn't touched it. As I approached, the hum grew louder, sharper, until it became a voice. "Wrong place," it whispered, cutting through the static. "Wrong time." I grabbed the remote and turned the TV off. The room plunged into silence, except for the sound of my own breathing. I backed away slowly, my skin crawling, and bumped into something solid. A hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing there. My shoulder felt cold, like ice had burned through my shirt. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Over the next week, the cracks in reality widened. My phone started glitching, showing notifications from apps I didn't have, messages from numbers I didn't recognize. The sky outside my window turned the wrong shade of blue, like a photo filter applied too heavily. Once, I caught my neighbor unlocking her door, only to realize her key didn't match the lock at all. She stepped inside anyway, as if the door had never been locked to begin with. But it was the mirrors that scared me the most. I stopped looking at them after the 3rd time. I caught my reflection moving on its own. By the time I realized I was being followed, it was already too late. I saw the man in the gray suit everywhere, on the subway, in the parking lot, standing at the corner of my street, always watching, always still. He never got closer, but he didn't have to. One night, I dreamed of him. I was standing in an empty field, the sky above me swirling with dark clouds. The man was there, his unfinished face clearer than ever, his eyes burning like coals. "You don't belong," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "Fix it, or it will break." When I woke up, my apartment was different. The layout was the same, but the furniture was wrong. My couch had stripes instead of a solid color. My coffee table was round instead of square. Even the smell was off, like citrus instead of lavender. I tried calling someone, anyone, but my contacts were gone, replaced with a single name, Watcher. I stared at the phone for a long time before pressing the number. The line clicked, but no one spoke. I listened, waiting, until I heard the hum again. "You shouldn't be here," the voice whispered. "The cracks are spreading. What do you want from me?" I shouted into the phone, my voice breaking. There was no answer. The line went dead. That was 3 days ago. Now, the cracks are everywhere. My apartment changes every time I look away. Sometimes the wallpaper is green. Sometimes there's no wallpaper at all. My reflection has stopped pretending to be me. It just watches, smiling faintly whenever I catch its eye. The man in the gray suit is closer now. He stands outside my window at night, his burning eyes the only light in the darkness. I don't think he'll wait much longer. The first thing I noticed was the clock. I just moved into this old farmhouse on the edge of town, the kind of place that came with a bargain price tag and way too much charm for its own good. It had a wraparound porch, creaky floorboards, and a sense of history that hung in the air like the faint smell of wood smoke. The clock was already there when I moved in, mounted on the wall in the dining room. It was huge, an antique grandfather clock with dark oak wood and a brass pendulum that swung in slow, deliberate arcs. The hands were ornately carved, the numbers painted in faded gold. I liked it at first. It felt like it belonged to the house, as much a part of it as the creaking stairs or the drafty windows. But then I realized something was off. The clock didn't work. At first, I thought it was just broken. The hands were frozen at 3:15, and the pendulum had stopped swinging. I tried winding it, but the mechanism wouldn't budge. I figured I'd call a repairman eventually, but there were more pressing things to worry about. Unpacking, fixing the leaky sink, figuring out why the upstairs bathroom smelled faintly of sulfur. Still, I couldn't help but notice the clock. No matter where I was in the house, it seemed to draw my attention, like a faint pull at the back of my mind. And then, one night, it started ticking. It was around midnight. I just finished brushing my teeth when I heard the sound. A steady, rhythmic tick-tock echoing through the house. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I walked into the dining room, half expecting to find nothing but silence. But the clock was moving. The pendulum swung gently back and forth, and the hands were no longer frozen. They were moving, slowly but steadily, creeping toward midnight. I stared at it for a long time, my skin prickling with unease. I hadn't touched it. There was no reason for it to start working again. But the ticking was real, loud enough to drown out the creaks of the house settling around me. I went to bed with the door locked. The next morning, the clock was stopped again, its hands frozen at 3:15. I tried to ignore it, but every night, at exactly midnight, the ticking would start again. The hands would begin their slow crawl toward midnight, only to freeze once more at 3:15 by morning. It became part of my routine, brushing my teeth, climbing into bed, listening to the steady ticking echo through the house. I told myself it was just a quirk of the house, a harmless mystery I'd figure out eventually. Until the night I woke up at 3:15. At first, I didn't know why I'd woken up. The house was quiet, the air still. But then I noticed the faint glow seeping under my bedroom door. It was coming from the dining room. Heart pounding, I crept out of bed and down the stairs. The glow grew brighter as I approached, a cold, bluish light that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. When I reached the dining room, I froze. The clock was glowing. The brass pendulum shimmered like liquid gold, and the hands were spinning wildly, faster than any clock should have been able to move. The ticking was deafening, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to rattle in my chest. And then, as I stared, the clock struck midnight. The light flared, blinding me. I stumbled backward, shielding my eyes, and when the glow finally faded, the room was dark again. The clock was still. The pendulum had stopped, and the hands were frozen at 3:15. But I wasn't alone. There was a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and gaunt, its body draped in tattered, shadowy fabric that seemed to ripple and shift like smoke. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, as it stared at me. Neither of us moved. The air in the room felt heavy, like the space between us was charged with static electricity. Then, without a sound, the figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed at the clock. The message was clear: fix it. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen with fear, but when I finally blinked, the figure was gone. The next morning, I called a clock repairman. He was an older guy, the kind who looked like he'd been fixing clocks since before I was born. When he saw the grandfather clock, his face went pale. "You got this from someone?" he asked, his voice tense. "No," I said. "It came with the house." "Why?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Sometimes clocks like this, they're more than just clocks." "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. He just set to work, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the clock's mechanism. After a few minutes, he let out a low whistle. "Well, there's your problem," he said, pulling something out of the clock's inner workings. It was a small, rusted key. "Looks like it was jammed in here. No wonder it wasn't running right." He handed me the key, and for a moment, I felt a jolt of cold shoot up my arm. It wasn't like touching metal. It felt alive, like something in the key recognized me. The clock has been quiet since then. No more ticking, no more glowing. But every night, I dream of the figure in the corner, watching me with hollow eyes. And the key? It's still on my nightstand. I can't seem to get rid of it. Sometimes, I swear it's growing warmer. I was doing deliveries that night. It was supposed to be a quick gig, just a few hours of dropping off takeout orders around the city. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover the utilities I'd been putting off. It was raining, a steady drizzle that blurred the glow of streetlights and made the road slick. The kind of night where you just want to finish up and go home. Everything was routine until I got the last order. Noah's Eats, apartment 509, 76, Darby Lane. A nondescript name and an address I didn't recognize. The app showed it was in a neighborhood on the outskirts of town. One of those areas where the roads feel narrower, the houses older, and the street signs harder to find. I pulled up to the building a little after 10 p.m. It was a squat, concrete structure that looked more like a bunker than an apartment complex. The rain had picked up by then, hammering against my windshield as I killed the engine and grabbed the food back. The lobby was dimly lit. The kind of place that smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning products that didn't quite mask the years of wear. The elevator was out of order, of course, so I took the stairs. The stairwell echoed with each step, amplifying the sound until it felt like I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the 5th floor, I was winded, damp from the rain, and annoyed. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with peeling wallpaper and doors that seemed to lean on their hinges. Apartment 509 was at the far end. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, shifting the bag in my arms. I could hear faint noises inside. Movement, a shuffle, maybe, but no one came to the door. "Delivery," I called out. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. The door creaked open, just a crack, enough to see a sliver of darkness beyond it. "You can leave it there," said a voice. It was low and raspy, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. I hesitated. Okay. Just need your signature." The door opened a little wider, but no one stepped into view. The hallway light barely penetrated the apartment's interior, leaving everything beyond the threshold in shadow. I squinted, trying to make out a figure. "Leave it," the voice repeated, firmer this time. I don't know why I didn't just set the bag down and walk away. Something about the situation felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like the hallway itself was holding its breath. "All right," I said slowly, crouching to place the bag on the floor. My fingers brushed something wet on the carpet, and I pulled my hand back instinctively, staring at the dark smear on my palm. It was sticky. "What the hell?" I muttered, wiping my hand on my jeans. The door slammed shut, hard. I flinched, stumbling back and almost tripping over my own feet. My heart was racing as I stared at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from behind me. I stopped, turned. The door to apartment 509 was slightly ajar again, and something was peeking out. Not a person, at least, not entirely. It was pale, almost white, with fingers too long and knobby joints that bent at odd angles. The hand, if you could call it that, was tapping against the edge of the door, like it was beckoning me back. I didn't move. Couldn't. Then the door opened wider, and I saw more of it. A face, or what might have been a face, with sunken, hollow sockets where the eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched into a grin, jagged teeth glinting faintly in the dim light. I bolted. I don't remember getting back to my car. One moment, I was in that hallway, and the next, I was behind the wheel, fumbling with the keys and peeling out of the parking lot so fast the tires skidded on the wet pavement. When I got home, I locked the door, double-checked it, and sat in the dark for hours, replaying what I'd seen. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light, my overactive imagination. But then the notification came. A review from Noah's Eats popped up in the app. Thanks for the delivery. We'll be seeing you soon. My phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time, a new delivery request. 76 Darby Lane, apartment 509. I deleted the app, blocked the number, swore off deliveries for good. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. I was walking home late one evening, earbuds in, my favorite playlist running on shuffle. The streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're the last person left in the world. The music was a comfort, filling the empty spaces around me as I took the familiar path to my apartment. And then it happened. Halfway through a track, the music cut out. No warning, no glitch, just sudden silence. I pulled my phone from my pocket, frowning at the screen. The playlist was still running, the progress bar moving as if the song were playing. But there was no sound. I tapped the screen, pausing and replaying the track. Still nothing. Annoyed, I skipped to the next song and froze. The new song wasn't on my playlist. I knew every track in that playlist, every beat, every lyric. This wasn't one of them. The title read Hush, and the artist was listed as unknown. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was a bug, some random track shuffled in by the algorithm. But the thing was, the app wasn't connected to the internet. I had downloaded every song myself. Before I could decide what to do, the song started playing. It was haunting, soft at first. Just a simple melody, like a music box winding down. The notes were slow and deliberate, each one hanging in the air a second too long, filling the silence with a strange, aching tension. And then the voice came. It wasn't singing, not exactly. It was more like a whisper, close and intimate, as though someone were speaking directly into my ear. The words were hard to make out at first, distorted and low, but as I kept listening, they became clearer. Do you hear me? I'm waiting. Don't turn away. I yanked the earbuds out, my heart racing. The music stopped, leaving only the faint hum of the city around me. I told myself it was just a glitch, just some weird track that had found its way onto my phone. But when I looked at the screen again, the song was gone. My playlist had resumed, the same old tracks playing as though nothing had happened. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I reached the door to my apartment building, the melody started again. This time, it wasn't coming from my phone. It was faint, drifting on the breeze like a half-remembered lullaby. I turned, scanning the empty street, but there was no one there. The melody grew louder, insistent, and I realized it was coming from somewhere inside the building. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The music led me up the stairs, past my floor, to the door of an apartment I'd never paid much attention to. Apartment 6C. The door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of a flickering light spilling into the hallway. The melody was louder now, seeping through the crack like it was alive. I should have walked away. I knew that, but something about the song pulled at me, a strange mix of fear and curiosity. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was empty. No furniture, no signs of anyone living there. Just bare walls and a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The melody echoed through the space, though there was no visible source. And then I saw it. In the center of the room was a mirror, tall and ornate, its silver frame tarnished and worn. The glass wasn't reflective, though. It was dark, almost black, like the surface of a still pond at midnight. The melody seemed to emanate from it, vibrating through the floor and walls. I stepped closer, my reflection faintly visible in the dim glass. But it wasn't quite right. My face was blurred, distorted, like a smudge on a photograph. As I stared, the reflection began to shift. My reflection tilted its head, even though I hadn't moved. It raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, and pressed it against the inside of the glass. Do you hear me? The voice whispered again, clearer this time. I'm waiting. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding. The reflection followed, its movements fluid and unnatural, like it was underwater. It smiled, a wide, eerie grin that sent a chill down my spine. Who are you? I managed to choke out. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to something behind me. I turned, my heart in my throat, but the room was still empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the reflection was gone. The melody stopped. For a moment, everything was still. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Then, slowly, the glass began to crack. Tiny fractures spiderwebbed across the surface, spreading outward until the entire mirror was veined with sharp, glimmering lines. And then it shattered. The sound was deafening, 1,000 shards scattering across the floor. I shielded my face, expecting to feel the sting of broken glass, but when I opened my eyes, the room was intact. The mirror stood as it had before, unbroken. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood in the reflection, though it wasn't mine. It was tall and shadowy, its edges blurred like smoke. Its eyes were bright and unblinking, fixed directly on me. "Now I hear you," it whispered, "and I'm coming." The light bulb flickered once, twice, and went out. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, the earbuds still in my ears. The playlist was playing, the familiar songs looping as though nothing had happened. But my phone felt heavier in my hand, and when I unlocked it, a new notification waited on the screen. New song added to playlist, Hush. The melody started playing again. I never thought I'd go back to my hometown. I left it behind years ago, a place full of ghosts and bad memories. But when my mom called, saying she needed someone to clear out Grandma's old house after her death, I didn't have much of a choice. Nobody else in the family wanted to do it, and I couldn't leave her to handle it alone. The house sat at the edge of town, a crumbling Victorian surrounded by tangled, overgrown hedges and a fence missing half its slats. It looked worse than I remembered. Peeling paint, warped shutters, and an air of neglect that made the place feel like it was sinking into the earth. Inside, it was no better. Dust coated every surface, cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air smelled stale, like time had stopped moving the day Grandma passed. We started in the kitchen, Mom and I, sorting through old dishes, tossing expired canned goods, and finding little treasures that she insisted on keeping. Grandma had been a hoarder, and the task felt impossible, like emptying an ocean with a spoon. In the middle of the chaos, I found it. A little wooden box tucked into the back of a cupboard. It was locked, and there was no key in sight. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. Mom frowned, her brow furrowing. "I don't know. Never seen it before. Maybe one of her keepsakes." It felt heavier than it should have, and something inside rattled faintly when I shook it. I was about to ask if we should force it open, but Mom had already moved on, digging through another box of old linens. That night, I stayed in the house while Mom went back to her place. I figured I could get more done without distractions, and honestly, I wanted to get it over with. I put the little wooden box on the dining table and stared at it for a long time. There was something about it that unsettled me, though I couldn't say why. It was just a box, old, scuffed, and unremarkable. Eventually, curiosity won. I grabbed a screwdriver from the junk drawer and pried the lock open. Inside was a bundle of photographs. They were black and white, worn around the edges, and smelled faintly of mildew. At first, they seemed like ordinary family photos. People I didn't recognize, standing in front of the house in its better days. But as I flipped through them, I noticed something strange. In every photo, there was a man. He stood in the background, always at the edge of the frame. Sometimes he was peeking around a tree or leaning against the fence. In one, he was standing in a window on the second floor, looking down at the people posing on the porch. I didn't recognize him. He didn't look like anyone from our family, and his face was wrong, blurry, even though everything else in the photos was sharp and clear. A shiver ran down my spine. I put the photos back in the box, shut the lid, and pushed it to the other side of the table. That's when the knocking started. It was faint at first, just a light tap tap tap, like branches brushing against a window. But it grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty house. I grabbed my phone and walked to the front door, ready to tell whoever it was that they had the wrong house. But when I opened it, no one was there. The street was empty. The wind rustled through the overgrown hedges, but there was no sign of anyone. I shut the door, feeling uneasy, and went back to the dining room. The box was gone. I searched the entire house, turning over every dusty box and rummaging through piles of junk, but it was nowhere to be found. That night, I slept in Grandma's old room, the only one that wasn't cluttered to the ceiling with stuff. I dreamed of the man in the photos. In the dream, I was standing in the dining room, holding the box. The man was there, too, sitting at the table with his hands folded neatly in front of him. His face was still blurry, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and heavy. "Why did you open it?" he asked, his voice low and rasping. "I didn't mean to," I stammered. "You can't put it back," he said. "It's yours now." When I woke up, the room was freezing, even though it was the middle of summer. My breath fogged the air as I sat up, heart pounding. On the nightstand beside the bed was the box. The lock was intact, like it had never been broken. I didn't touch it. The next day, I told Mom I couldn't do it anymore. I made up some excuse about work and left Ridgewood for good. But the box came with me. No matter where I go, it shows up. On my kitchen counter, on the passenger seat of my car, even at the foot of my bed. I've tried getting rid of it, throwing it in the trash, burning it, even burying it in the woods. It always comes back. And at night, when the house is quiet, I hear the knocking. It's getting closer. There's a road about 10 miles outside of town that no one drives at night. Locals call it Ashburn Hollow, and it's surrounded by dense woods so thick they block out the moonlight. It's not marked on most maps, and even GPS tends to lose its bearings there. I'd always thought the stories about it were exaggerated, urban legends to scare teenagers into behaving. But last year, I found out how wrong I was. It started with a dare. My friend Nate had just gotten a new truck, and he was obsessed with testing it on spooky roads. One Friday night, after a few beers around a bonfire, someone brought up Ashburn Hollow. Nate, always the thrill seeker, grinned and said, "Let's do it. What's the worst that could happen?" I didn't want to go. Something about the way people talked about the hollow always unsettled me. They'd mention the road like it was a living thing, as if it had a memory of its own. But I didn't want to be the killjoy of the group, so I reluctantly agreed. There were 4 of us, me, Nate, our friend Jess, and her boyfriend, Sam. We piled into Nate's truck around 11 p.m. and headed out of town. By the time we reached the entrance to Ashburn Hollow, the air felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. The trees seemed taller here, their branches twisting together like claws. The road itself was narrow and unpaved, with deep grooves that made the truck's tires bump and lurch. The headlights illuminated a short stretch ahead, but beyond that, the darkness seemed impenetrable. Jess tried to lighten the mood by playing music on her phone, but the signal cut out the moment we entered the hollow. "Convenient," she muttered, tossing her phone into her lap. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Nate laughed and joked about how overblown the stories were. "Ooh, scary road," he mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's next, a ghost hitchhiker?" "Shut up," Jess said, glancing out the window. "This place is creepy enough without you tempting fate." Then the truck's engine stuttered. Nate frowned and tapped the gas pedal. The truck jerked forward, then stalled completely, leaving us stranded in the middle of the road. He tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't turn over. "It's a new truck," he said, his voice edged with confusion. "This shouldn't be happening." The headlights flickered, then went out, plunging us into complete darkness. "Is this a joke?" Sam asked, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Because it's not funny." "It's not a joke," Nate snapped, twisting the key in frustration. The engine coughed once, but didn't start. Jess pulled out her phone to use the flashlight, but her screen stayed black. "It was fully charged," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. I checked my phone too. Nothing. Even the time display was gone, just a blank, unresponsive screen. We sat in silence, the air in the truck growing colder. That's when we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It came from somewhere outside, but it was hard to tell which direction. "Probably just a branch," Nate said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It moved, circling the truck, pausing by each window. I felt my chest tighten as I gripped the door handle, half expecting something to reach out of the darkness and rip it open. "Do you see anything?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. Nate grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and shone it out the window. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing. Just trees and the empty road stretching ahead. Then the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was too quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath. And then we saw them. Shapes, moving in the trees. They were tall and thin, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, almost insect-like. Their eyes glinted faintly, reflecting the beam of Nate's flashlight. There were dozens of them, maybe more, stepping out from between the trees, their heads tilting as if studying us. "Start the truck," Jess hissed. "I'm trying," Nate shouted, turning the key again and again. The engine sputtered but refused to catch. The figures drew closer, their movements eerily synchronized. One of them reached out, its hand pressing against the driver's side window. Its fingers were impossibly long, ending in sharp, black tips that scraped against the glass. "Get out of here," Sam yelled, grabbing a tire iron from under the seat. "Where?" Nate shot back. "We're surrounded." The creature at the window leaned closer, and for the first time, I saw its face, or what should have been a face. There were no features, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over a skull-like shape. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and a sound like static filled the truck. I panicked, reaching for the door handle, but Nate grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said. "You open that door, and we're dead." The static grew louder, piercing, like it was burrowing into my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. Beside me, Jess was sobbing, and even Nate looked like he was about to break. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The creatures froze, their heads snapping towards something further down the road. I followed their gaze and saw a single light in the distance, faint but growing brighter. It was a car, its engine roaring as it sped toward us. The creatures scattered, melting back into the trees as the car screeched to a halt beside us. An older man rolled down the window, his face lined and weathered. "You need to leave," he said, his voice firm. "Now." "Our truck's dead," Nate shouted. The man nodded grimly. "It won't start here. You need to push it out of the hollow. Now." We didn't argue. With the man's help, we pushed the truck down the road, the air growing warmer and lighter with each step. By the time we reached the edge of the hollow, the truck roared to life without Nate even touching the key. The man didn't explain, and we didn't ask. He just told us to drive and not look back. And we didn't. Not until we were miles away, back in the safety of town. None of us talk about that night, but I still think about the hollow, about the shapes in the trees and the static in my head. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint tapping at my window, and I wonder if we really left them behind, or if they're just waiting for me to come back. I was never one to believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that supernatural nonsense. I'm practical, grounded. At least, I was. That changed after I bought the mirror. It was an impulse purchase, something I picked up at an estate sale on my way back from work. The mirror was beautiful, antique, with a heavy wooden frame carved into intricate, swirling patterns. The kind of thing that looked like it belonged in an old castle or a Victorian mansion. It wasn't expensive either, which was surprising given its craftsmanship. The woman running the sale practically begged me to take it, insisting on knocking the price down when I hesitated. In hindsight, that should have been a red flag. I hung it in the hallway just outside my bedroom. It fit perfectly there, catching the light in a way that made the carvings seem almost alive. At first, it felt like the mirror elevated the whole apartment, gave it a kind of old-world charm I didn't know it was missing. But that feeling didn't last long. The first time something felt off, it was subtle. I was walking past the mirror late at night, heading to the kitchen for water, when I thought I saw movement. Not me, something behind me. I stopped, turning to look over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. When I glanced back at the mirror, though, I saw it again. A flicker, like a shadow darting out of view. I shook it off as tired eyes and went back to bed. A few nights later, I woke up feeling strange, like someone was watching me. My bedroom door was open, and the hallway beyond was dark, but I could see the faint outline of the mirror, its surface catching just enough light to glint in the shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw something standing in the hallway, a tall, dark figure, barely more than an outline. But when I blinked, it was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, but the feeling didn't go away. The mirror started showing things. At first, it was small. I'd glance at it and catch a glimpse of something that wasn't there when I turned to look, like a hand resting on the edge of the frame, long and thin, with pale, spindly fingers. Or I'd see my reflection smiling when my face wasn't. One morning, I was brushing my teeth, half asleep, when I glanced at the mirror and froze. My reflection was staring at me, but not in the way it should have been. Its head was tilted at an angle mine wasn't, and its eyes, they weren't mine. They were darker, hollow, with faint, shifting shapes moving in the depths. I dropped my toothbrush and stumbled back, and just like that, it was gone. The mirror looked normal again. I should have gotten rid of it then. I even tried once. I took it off the wall and lugged it out to the curb for the garbage collectors. But when I came back into the apartment, it was hanging in the hallway again, exactly where it had been. I told myself I was imagining things, that I must have brought it back inside without realizing it. But I knew better. Deep down, I knew. The dreams started after that. Night after night, I'd find myself standing in a long, dark hallway, identical to mine but somehow wrong. The air felt heavy, and the only light came from the mirror at the end of the corridor. In the dreams, it was different, larger, with a surface that shimmered like black water. I always walked toward it, unable to stop myself, even though every part of me screamed to turn back. When I reached it, something on the other side would move. A shadow, growing larger and closer, until I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat. The real turning point came about a week ago. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling on my phone, when the mirror made a sound. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass. My heart jumped into my throat, and I stared at it, frozen. The tapping stopped. Then, slowly, something began to emerge from the glass. It was a hand, pale, clawed, and impossibly long. Reaching out like the mirror wasn't solid at all. The hand grasped the edge of the frame, and a face followed, elongated, gaunt, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Its mouth twisted into a grin, impossibly wide, as it pulled itself halfway out of the mirror. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was looking right at me, its head tilting back and forth, like it was studying me. Then it spoke, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but something that scraped against the inside of my skull. Trade places. I bolted. I grabbed my keys and left the apartment, not even stopping for my shoes. I spent the night in my car, parked at a gas station 2 towns over. When I finally worked up the courage to go back the next day, the mirror was still there, hanging in the hallway like nothing had happened. But the glass was different. It was darker, almost black, and when I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. I saw the hallway from my dreams, and I saw it standing at the end, waiting. I haven't gone back since. The landlord's been calling, leaving voicemails asking why I've abandoned the apartment, threatening to change the locks. I don't care. Let them have it. Let them deal with whatever that thing is. But last night, I checked into a motel, thinking I was finally safe. And this morning, when I opened the closet, the mirror was there, leaning against the back wall. It's following me. I don't know how to stop it. And the worst part? When I looked into the glass this time, I saw myself. But it wasn't me. It was smiling. The bar at the edge of town had no name. Its weathered sign had long since faded, leaving only ghostly traces of letters that no one could decipher. Locals called it the Hollow, though no one could tell you why. It wasn't on any maps, and you didn't stumble across it by accident. You found the Hollow when you needed it, or maybe when it needed you. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. They said people went in looking for answers and came out different. Not always better, but undeniably changed. Some swore the bar granted wishes. Others said it revealed truths you weren't ready to face. I didn't believe any of it. But that night, with nowhere else to go and a storm bearing down, I found myself in front of its peeling door. The place was almost empty when I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and rain, a strange comfort. A jukebox in the corner hummed softly, though no one had fed it coins. Behind the bar stood a man polishing a glass, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He didn't look up as I approached, but he spoke. "What'll it be?" His voice was low, smooth, like the first notes of a jazz tune. "Whiskey," I said, sliding onto a stool. My hands were still damp from the rain, and I shoved them into my jacket pockets to stop their trembling. He poured the drink without asking my preference, setting the glass down in front of me. The amber liquid caught the dim light, shimmering like something alive. I took a sip, expecting the usual burn, but instead, the warmth spread through me, calm and disarming. "You're here for a reason," he said, leaning on the counter. His eyes were dark, deep enough to drown in. They always are. I laughed nervously. "What, are you psychic or something?" He didn't answer, just nodded toward the mirror behind the bar. It was cracked in one corner, distorting the reflections like a funhouse trick. But when I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw someone else. It was a version of me, but not me. Her hair was longer, her eyes sharper, her posture confident in a way I'd never been. She looked at me through the glass, tilting her head as if sizing me up. "What the hell?" I whispered, leaning closer. The glass felt cold against my fingertips. "That's who you could have been," the bartender said, his tone matter of fact. "If you'd made a different choice." My heart pounded in my chest. "What choice? You tell me." The mirror shifted, the image inside rippling like water. Suddenly, I was watching a scene from years ago. A college dorm room, dimly lit and cluttered with textbooks. I recognized the girl sitting on the bed, her head in her hands. Me, younger, unsure, and standing at a crossroads I barely remembered. The memory came flooding back. I'd been offered an internship in New York, a dream opportunity, but I turned it down, afraid of leaving home, of failing, of the unknown. I stayed in my small town, took a safe job, and tried not to think about what could have been. The woman in the mirror stared at me, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem angry, but there was a sadness in her eyes that mirrored my own. "I made my choice," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's the point of looking back now?" The bartender smiled faintly, setting another glass beside the first. This one was filled with something dark, almost black, with hints of red swirling through it. "Because tonight, you get a second chance." I frowned, eyeing the drink. "What is that?" "Possibility," he said simply. I laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "You're kidding." "Not at all. Drink it, and you'll wake up in a different life. The life you didn't choose." But his eyes locked onto mine, serious now. "You can't come back. Once the choice is made, it's final." My breath caught. The weight of the offer settled over me, heavy and undeniable. I looked back at the mirror. The woman, my other self, was still there, watching, waiting. Her life flashed behind her. The apartment in the city, the late nights chasing deadlines, the excitement and struggle and freedom I'd always wondered about. "Why would you offer this to me?" I asked, suspicion creeping in. "Because you asked for it," he replied, his tone soft but firm. "Not out loud, maybe, but deep down, you've been asking for years." I stared at the glass, the liquid inside seeming to pulse, alive with potential. My mind raced with questions. Would I miss this life? My friends? My family? Or would I finally feel like I belonged somewhere, like I was the person I was meant to be? "What happens if I don't drink it?" I asked. The bartender shrugged. "Then you leave. Go back to your life, just as it is. No tricks, no punishment. Some people aren't ready to see what's behind the door." I glanced at the door, the rain still hammering against it outside. The storm seemed so far away now, muted by the weight of the moment. My fingers curled around the glass, cool and smooth in my hand. The woman in the mirror nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if giving me permission. I raised the glass to my lips. The liquid was warm, like fire and silk, filling my veins with a rush of energy. The room blurred, the bartender's face fading into the background as the world tilted and spun. I closed my eyes, holding onto the sensation of falling upward into something vast and unknowable. When I opened them, I was standing in a high-rise apartment, the city skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A desk piled with papers sat in the corner, a coffee mug half empty beside it. On the wall, a photo of me, this version of me, smiling with people I didn't recognize but somehow felt connected to. The life I'd left behind was already slipping from my memory, like a dream upon waking. But one thought lingered. Had I made the right choice? Or had I just traded one set of regrets for another? The only thing I knew for sure was that the hollow had given me what I'd asked for, and it would never let me back in. The first time I noticed it, I was coming out of the subway. It was late, and the platform was nearly deserted except for me and a man standing at the far end. I didn't pay him much attention at first, just a quick glance as I adjusted my bag and climbed the stairs. But then I noticed something strange. He wasn't standing. He was frozen mid-step. His foot was hovering just above the platform, his body leaning forward as if he'd been walking but suddenly stopped in time. At first, I thought maybe he was some kind of street performer pulling a trick, but there were no wires, no contraptions. Just a man, perfectly still, defying gravity. I stared, unsure of what to do. The hairs on my arms prickled, and a cold wave washed over me. Then, without warning, he moved, like a glitch. 1 second he was frozen, the next he was upright, his foot firmly on the ground, looking directly at me. His eyes locked on mine, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a knowing one, like he'd caught me in the act of something I wasn't supposed to see. I left the station as fast as I could, my heart pounding. I didn't tell anyone about it because what was there to say? That a man paused reality for a moment and stared into my soul? I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, a fatigue-fueled hallucination. But it wasn't. The next time, I was at work. I'd stepped into the break room to grab a coffee, and when I came back, the entire office was silent. Not the usual hum of keyboards and printers, not even the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Just silence. I stood in the doorway, confused. Everyone was sitting at their desks, but they weren't moving, not blinking, not typing, not breathing. One of my coworkers had her hand hovering over her mouse, frozen mid-click. A paper someone had been tossing into the trash was suspended in the air. I dropped my coffee. The cup hit the floor, shattering into pieces, and that's when it happened again. Time skipped. 1 second, everyone was frozen. The next, they were back, typing, chatting, laughing. No one seemed to notice anything strange. Except me. And him. He was standing by the copy machine, wearing the same knowing smile. It was the same man from the subway, but this time, he was in a suit, blending perfectly into the office. I stared at him, my mouth dry, and he gave me the smallest nod before disappearing around the corner. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong. With the world, with reality itself. And it wasn't done with me. Over the next few weeks, the incidents became more frequent. A jogger frozen mid-stride in the park. A bird suspended in mid-air, its wings outstretched but unmoving. A glass slipping from a waiter's hand and stopping inches before it hit the ground. Each time, he was there, watching, smiling, always at the edge of the scene, as if he were the one pulling the strings. I tried to confront him once. It was at a coffee shop. I'd seen him sitting by the window, staring at me as I stood in line. My hands were trembling, my pulse racing, but I forced myself to walk up to him. "Who are you?" I demanded, louder than I intended. "What's happening?" He looked up at me, tilting his head as if considering how much to tell me. Then, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You're not supposed to notice," he said, his voice low and calm. "Most people don't." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached across the table and tapped my forehead lightly with his finger. And everything stopped. The barista froze mid-pour, coffee spilling in an impossible arc. The man behind me in line was mid-yawn, his mouth open wide. Outside, Cars were frozen in the middle of the intersection, pigeons hanging motionless in the air. I couldn't move either. I could only watch as he stood and walked around me, studying me like a bug under a microscope. "You're slipping," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. "You're seeing things you shouldn't. That's dangerous." "Why?" I managed to whisper, though I didn't know how. His expression darkened. "Because they'll notice." "Who?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he snapped his fingers, and time lurched forward. The coffee splashed into a cup. The man behind me finished his yawn. Outside, cars honked impatiently, but the man was gone. That was a week ago. Since then, things have gotten worse. Time skips more frequently now, sometimes for just a second, sometimes for minutes. And it's not just objects and people freezing anymore. I've started seeing glitches. A car reversing through an intersection, then disappearing. A woman walking into a building, only to walk out seconds later wearing a completely different outfit. Sometimes I hear whispers in a language I don't understand, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. And sometimes I see shadows where there shouldn't be any. Tall, dark figures that flicker at the edges of my vision, always moving closer when I look away. I don't know what's happening to me, but I think the man was right. I'm slipping. I'm seeing things I was never meant to see, noticing cracks in the fabric of reality. And now, whatever's on the other side of those cracks is noticing me too. Last night, I found a note on my pillow. It wasn't written in my handwriting. "They're watching. Run." I don't know if I can. I was cleaning out the attic of my grandmother's house, sorting through decades of forgotten things. The air was thick with dust, the kind that clings to your throat, and the dim light filtering through the single grimy window gave everything an otherworldly glow. Most of the attic was the usual clutter. Old photo albums, yellowed newspapers, mismatched furniture. But in the far corner, partially buried under a pile of moth-eaten blankets, was a box I'd never seen before. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped tightly in what looked like old twine. The twine was frayed in places, but it still held firm, the knots tight and deliberate. The box itself was made of a dark wood, smooth and polished despite its obvious age. There was no dust on it, no sign that it had been sitting in the attic for years like everything else. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled it out from under the blankets and carried it to the center of the room, where the light was a little stronger. As I examined it, I noticed an inscription carved into the lid, "Do not open." Well, that only made me want to open it more. I tugged at the twine, but it didn't give. After a few minutes of struggling, I grabbed a pair of scissors from a nearby box and cut through the knots. The moment the twine fell away, a strange sensation washed over me, like the air in the attic had shifted, grown heavier somehow. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lid. A small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "Don't do it," but I ignored it. I had to know. The lid came off with a soft pop, and I peered inside. At first, it didn't look like much. Just a stack of photographs, black and white, their edges worn and curling. I pulled the top one out and held it up to the light. It was a picture of a man standing in a field, his back to the camera. The photo was grainy, the details hard to make out, but something about the way he stood made my skin crawl. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like he wasn't just standing, like he was waiting. I set the photo aside and picked up the next one. It was a picture of the same field, but the man was closer now, turned slightly toward the camera. His face was blurred, indistinct, but I could see his hand reaching out as if beckoning. Each photo in the stack was like that. The man moving closer, his features becoming clearer with each shot. By the fifth photo, I could see his face, a gaunt, hollow visage with sunken eyes that seemed to stare directly at me, no matter which way I turned the picture. By the seventh, he was so close it felt like he was about to step out of the frame. I stopped there, my hands shaking. The rest of the photos felt heavier now, as though the weight of the entire box had transferred to them. I didn't want to look at the last one. Every instinct screamed at me to put them back, close the box, and walk away. But I couldn't. With trembling fingers, I picked up the final photo. My breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of the attic, the same room I was sitting in, down to the smallest detail. The boxes, the furniture, even the light filtering through the window, it was all there. But in the corner of the photo, standing just behind me, was the man. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The attic was empty. I looked back at the photo. The man had moved. He was closer now, standing directly behind where I sat, his face turned toward the camera. His hand was reaching out again, this time toward me. I dropped the photo and stumbled back, nearly tripping over a pile of books. The air in the attic felt suffocating, thick and heavy like a storm was about to break. The light from the window dimmed, as though something was blocking it. And then I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound, coming from the far corner of the room, the corner where I'd found the box. I didn't want to look, but my body moved on its own, my head turning toward the noise. The blankets I'd pushed aside were shifting, stirring like something was underneath them. A low, guttural sound, half growl, half whisper, echoed through the attic, and I realized it wasn't coming from the blankets. It was coming from everywhere. "Do not look," the voice said, soft but commanding. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hands clamping over my ears. The sound grew louder, filling my head, my chest, my entire body. It was like the voice was inside me, rooting around in my thoughts, unearthing things I didn't even know were there. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The attic was silent again. The light returned, brighter now, almost blinding. When I opened my eyes, the box was gone. The photographs, the blankets, even the pile of books I'd tripped over, all gone, as though they'd never been there. I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I'd leave the house and never think about it again. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of the man from the photos. He was standing at the foot of my bed, his hand reaching out, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. When I woke up, there was a photograph on my pillow. It was a picture of me, taken from the attic, and behind me, just barely visible in the shadows, was the man, waiting. My friends and I were bored one night, scrolling through Reddit and urban legend forums, looking for something creepy to pass the time. That's when we stumbled across a post about the switch room. Supposedly, it was an experiment in lucid dreaming, or at least, that's how the original poster described it. You were supposed to follow a series of steps before bed, and if you did them correctly, you'd wake up somewhere else. "It's not real," Jake scoffed, leaning back on the couch. "Just another internet hoax to freak people out." "Of course it's not real," Sarah said, but she looked intrigued. "Still, it sounds kind of fun, right? Like, what if it did work?" I should have said no. I should have laughed it off and moved on to something else. But there was something about the way the instructions were written that stuck with me. It wasn't sensationalized, like the usual creepypasta. It was calm, precise. And there was one line at the end that gave me chills. "If you leave, you may not return as yourself." The steps were simple enough. 1. Close every door in your house before going to bed. 2. Turn off all the lights except for one in the room where you sleep. 3. Write your full name on a piece of paper and place it under your pillow. 4. Lie down, close your eyes, and say the words, "I am ready to wake up." "Let's try it," Sarah said, already pulling out her phone to take notes. Jake rolled his eyes, but I nodded. "Sure, why not?" I didn't think it would work. The first night, nothing happened. I followed the steps, felt silly whispering the words into the dark, and drifted off to sleep like usual. The next morning, everything was the same. "See?" Jake said, grinning over his coffee. "Told you it's fake." Sarah shrugged, but she looked disappointed. Maybe we didn't do it right. That night, we tried again. This time, when I woke up, something felt off. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things. My alarm clock was on the wrong side of the bed. The framed photo of my family on the dresser was missing. When I walked into the kitchen, the mugs in the cupboard were all white instead of the colorful ones I'd always had. "Did you move stuff around?" I asked Sarah when she joined me for breakfast. She frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The mugs," I said, opening the cabinet to show her. "They're different." She peered inside. then turned back to me with a puzzled expression. They've always been like that. I stared at her, waiting for her to crack a smile or admit she was messing with me, but she didn't. Jake came in a few minutes later, laughing about some meme he'd seen, and when I pointed out the changes to him, he just shrugged. "Dude, you're imagining things," he said. By the third night, I was sure something was wrong. I woke up to find my bedroom door open, even though I'd closed it before bed. The clock on my phone was stuck at 3:12 a.m. and wouldn't reset no matter what I did. And when I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face, I noticed a small cut on my cheek. I hadn't gone to bed with it, and I didn't remember scratching myself. I decided to stop playing the game, but Sarah was insistent. "Maybe we're just not doing it enough," she said. "It's like lucid dreaming, right? It takes practice." I didn't want to argue, so I let her and Jay continue. I stayed up that night, watching TV to avoid falling asleep. I must have drifted off at some point, though, because I woke up somewhere else. At first, I thought I was in my apartment. The layout was identical, the same furniture, the same rug, even the same faint stain on the coffee table. But the colors were wrong. Everything had a grayish tint, like the life had been sucked out of it, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like blood. "Sarah?" I called out. No answer. I walked through the apartment, but it was empty. The windows were dark, even though it should have been morning. When I opened the door to the hallway, I froze. The corridor stretched on endlessly, lined with identical doors on either side. The walls were pale and featureless, and the overhead lights flickered faintly, casting long, distorted shadows. I don't know how long I wandered. It could have been hours, or maybe only minutes. The doors didn't have numbers, and every time I opened one, I found myself staring into a room that wasn't quite right. My living room, but flipped like a mirror image. My bedroom, but with a strange stain on the ceiling. Eventually, I heard footsteps behind me. "Jake!" I called out, my voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. I turned slowly, heart hammering in my chest, but the hallway behind me was empty. "Sarah?" I whispered. The footsteps started again, faster this time. Closer. I ran. The next thing I remember is waking up in my bed, gasping for air. It was morning. Sunlight streamed through the window, and for a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had all been a dream. Then I noticed the cut on my cheek was deeper now. And when I went to the kitchen, the mugs were blue. I haven't told Jake or Sarah what happened. I'm not even sure they're the same Jake and Sarah anymore. They look the same, act the same, but there are little differences. Jake taps his fingers when he's nervous now, a habit he's never had before. Sarah hums songs she doesn't know the words to. I've stopped playing the game, but every night, I hear footsteps outside my bedroom door. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear a voice whisper, "Wake up." Late evening, nearly midnight, and the car was mostly empty save for a few stragglers. An old man nodding off in the corner, a couple engrossed in their phones, and a woman clutching a plastic bag filled with groceries. The hum of the train on the tracks was hypnotic, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead in that unnerving way they do. I had my headphones in, but no music playing. I liked the illusion of being unreachable while still being alert. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting a few rows ahead, a little girl no older than 6 or 7, wearing a bright yellow dress. Her feet didn't quite touch the floor, and she was swinging them absently, her hands gripping a stuffed rabbit with floppy ears. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids on the subway weren't exactly uncommon, though something about her being alone nagged at me. Where were her parents? I pulled out one earbud, glancing around. Nobody else seemed to notice her, or if they did, they weren't reacting. I thought maybe she'd just gotten separated from her family, and I debated whether I should ask if she needed help. Then, as if she felt my gaze, she turned around. Her face was pale, almost unnaturally so, like a porcelain doll left in the sun too long. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold, wide and glassy, completely black, as if the pupils had swallowed everything else. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. She stared at me for a long moment, unblinking, then raised a hand and pointed to the door at the far end of the car. I don't know why I got up. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear, Maybe it was something deeper that I didn't want to acknowledge. But before I knew it, I was standing, my feet carrying me toward the door. The little girl didn't move. She just watched me go, her head tilting slightly to the side, like a bird studying prey. The door at the end of the car wasn't supposed to open while the train was moving. I knew that. Everyone knew that. But as I reached it, I saw the latch was already undone, the door hanging open just a crack. Beyond it was nothing but darkness, the tunnel outside rushing past in a blur. I hesitated, one hand on the door frame. This was insane. I had no reason to step through, no reason to trust a strange little girl with black eyes who hadn't said a word. But then, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the roar of the train. "Come and see." The voice wasn't hers. It was deeper, rougher, like the rasp of dry leaves scraping together. My stomach churned, but my feet moved anyway, and I stepped through the door. The second I crossed the threshold, the noise of the train vanished. I turned, expecting to see the subway car behind me, but it was gone. So was the tunnel. I was standing in a long hallway, its walls lined with old, peeling wallpaper that might have once been floral, but was now just a smear of faded patterns. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of mildew and something metallic, like blood. I took a step forward, then another, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The hallway stretched on endlessly, its dim light coming from a single bulb swinging lazily from the ceiling. "Come and see." The voice came again, louder this time, echoing from somewhere up ahead. I didn't want to follow it, but what choice did I have? There was no door behind me, no way to go but forward. As I walked, I started to notice things. Photos hung crookedly on the walls, their glass cracked, their images warped. They were pictures of me. At first, they were from my childhood, blurry snapshots of birthday parties and family vacations. But as I moved deeper into the hallway, the photos changed. They were more recent now. Me at work, me eating dinner in my apartment, me sitting on the subway just minutes ago. My chest tightened, and I tore one of the frames off the wall, flipping it over. The back was blank, no date, no explanation, just the photo, and my face staring back at me. "Come and see." The voice was louder now, insistent. I dropped the frame and kept moving, my pace quickening as the hallway began to twist and curve, the walls closing in around me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. And then, suddenly, I was there. The hallway opened into a vast, circular room. The floor was black and reflective, like polished obsidian, and in the center stood a massive mirror, its frame ornate and gilded, covered in intricate carvings of faces contorted in agony. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite the gnawing terror in my gut. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, distorting my reflection. "Come and see," the voice whispered again, this time from directly behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was the little girl in the yellow dress, her black eyes fixed on mine. She smiled, a slow, unnatural stretch of her lips, then raised a hand and pointed again. This time, she pointed at me. The surface of the mirror shattered, shards flying outward without a sound. I stumbled back, throwing up my arms to shield myself, but when I opened my eyes, I was back on the subway. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors hissed open. I was alone now. The old man, the couple, the woman with the groceries, they were all gone. I stepped off the train, dazed, and glanced back at the window. In the reflection, the little girl was sitting in my seat, her black eyes staring right at me. The doors closed, and the train sped away. It was the perfect apartment, or so I thought. When I first saw it, I was ecstatic. It was a second-floor unit in a building that had clearly seen better days. But it had something the others didn't: character. The walls were high, the windows tall, the floors creaky in all the right places. There were built-in bookshelves, crown molding, and the apartment had that old, musty charm that I couldn't resist. The rent was low for the area, and it seemed like a steal. I signed the lease without a second thought. The landlord was an older man, Mr. Whitaker. He had a strange way of staring at me when we first met, his eyes intense, like he was trying to gauge if I could handle whatever this building had hidden beneath its peeling wallpaper. But I didn't think much of it. I'd seen eccentric landlords before. The first few days in the apartment were blissfully uneventful. I unpacked, got settled in, and reveled in the space. The city's noise seemed far away, muffled by the thick walls, and for the first time in a while, I felt at peace. But then, one night, I started hearing it. A sound, soft at first, almost like a whispering wind, came from the walls. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was constant. The kind of sound that's so faint it makes you second-guess yourself. Every night, it would start around 11 p.m. A quiet, airy sound that filled the apartment as if someone, or something, was moving just behind the plaster. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old buildings make noise, right? But then it started to get weirder. The sound turned into something else. A tapping. Not rhythmic, like someone knocking, but erratic, frantic. It would start slow, then speed up, as though whoever was on the other side of the wall was desperate to get out. I went next door to speak to my neighbor, Mrs. Pendleton, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years. She answered the door slowly, her eyes widening as I explained the noise. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at me, as though deciding whether or not she should speak. Finally, she whispered, "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" I nodded, uncomfortable. "The wall," she said, looking over her shoulder as though checking if anyone was listening. "It's not the building settling. It's him." I blinked. "Who?" "The man who lived here before you," she explained, her voice trembling. "He was, well, let's just say he was a strange one. Very quiet. Never had visitors. But then, one night, the tapping started. A kind of scratching, too. People said he was scratching at the walls, trying to get out. I felt a chill run through me. Did he leave?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Pendleton hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. "No one ever saw him leave. The landlord, he was the one who found him, said he'd been gone for weeks. No explanation. But the noise, the tapping, it never stopped." She gave me a pointed look, and I could see the weight of her words hanging in the air. I wanted to ask more, to understand exactly what had happened, but she shook her head and closed the door before I could. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the tapping continuing as if it were part of the rhythm of the house itself. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Around 2 a.m., I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and decided to investigate. I followed the sound, moving quietly through the dark apartment until I stood before the wall in my living room. It was coming from here. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart pounding in my chest. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy was being pulled from the other side. It was faint at first, but it grew louder the longer I listened. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, more of a faint rasping. I could barely make it out, but the words were unmistakable. "Help me, please." My blood ran cold. I stumbled back from the wall, my hands shaking. The voice wasn't a recording. It wasn't a dream. It was real, and it was coming from inside the wall. I ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing, and I had no idea what I was supposed to do. Should I call the police? Should I knock on the landlord's door at 3 in the morning? But then, a thought hit me. What if the landlord knew? What if he expected this to happen? I couldn't stay there, not with that voice behind the wall. I grabbed my things, quickly packed a bag, and left for the night. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the apartment. I spent hours walking around the city, trying to clear my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tapping. I heard the scratching. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. Finally, after hours of pacing, I went to the landlord's office. He wasn't there, but I could hear him talking through the closed door. I knocked, and Mr. Whitaker opened the door, his face pale. He looked at me with those sharp eyes, the same intense gaze he had when we first met. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice just a little too calm. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at him, trying to gauge if he was hiding something. "I need to know what happened to the tenant before me," I said, my voice shaking. His face twitched slightly, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for me to sit. "I've told people this before, but I guess you need to hear it too," he said, his voice low. "The man who lived there before you. His name was Victor. He was obsessed with something. Some kind of ritual, I think. He had books, papers, things that weren't meant for anyone else to see. And he kept hearing it too. The tapping." My pulse quickened. What did he do about it? "Nothing," Mr. Whitaker replied, his eyes distant. "He thought it was part of the building. But one night, he went into the wall. He disappeared." "What do you mean, disappeared?" "Literally," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We found his things, his clothes, his books, but no body. And that tapping, that scratching, it never stopped. It's like something is trying to get out. And now, it's you. It's calling for you." I stood up, backing away from him. "What are you saying?" "The wall is never empty. You see," he said, his eyes widening. "And you're next." I ran out of the office, my mind spinning, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had taken his place. The tapping had already begun to echo behind me, and it wouldn't stop until it had me too. I never went back to that apartment, and I'm telling you, if you ever hear that tapping, that faint scratching in the walls, you need to leave, because there's always something on the other side, waiting for the next person who dares to listen. It was on my doorstep one crisp October evening, just sitting there like it belonged. A plain brown box, sealed with cheap packing tape. No return address. No postage stamp. Just my name scrawled across the top in thick, uneven letters. The handwriting was strange, too jagged, as if someone had pressed the pen too hard into the cardboard. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, trying to piece together who might have left it. I hadn't ordered anything. I wasn't expecting a delivery, but curiosity got the better of me, and I carried it inside. The box wasn't heavy, but it rattled slightly when I set it down on the kitchen table. Whatever was inside was loose, moving just enough to make a faint, irregular sound. I hesitated before opening it, my hands hovering over the tape. Something about the box felt wrong. The kind of wrong that you can't explain. Like the first time you realize a room is too quiet. I tore the tape. Inside, nestled in crumpled newspaper, was an old cassette tape. The kind that looked like it belonged in the 80s, with clear plastic and tiny black reels. Written on the label in the same sharp handwriting was a single word, "Listen." I didn't own a cassette player. Who did anymore? The tape sat on my table for days, untouched, as I tried to forget about it. But it lingered in my mind, like a sliver caught under the skin. The newspaper it was packed in wasn't normal either. It was yellowed and brittle, with articles that seemed off somehow. Headlines like, "Local man vanishes in his own home," and "Windows without faces." None of them listed a date. The pictures were blurry, and the text warped as though it didn't want to be read. Finally, I broke. I needed to know. I found a second-hand cassette player at a thrift store, dusted it off, and brought it home. My hands shook as I slid the tape in and pressed play. At first, there was nothing. Just static, faint and crackling, like an old radio stuck between stations. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing as though they were in an empty hallway. They stopped after a few moments, and the silence that followed was worse. It stretched on for so long that I thought the tape had run out. Then, faintly, a voice. It was low, distorted, and familiar in a way that made my stomach churn. "Can you hear me?" it said. I froze. The voice was mine. The static surged again, louder this time, drowning out everything. And then, layered beneath it, I heard something else. Whispering. Faint and overlapping, too many voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I didn't want to. My finger hovered over the stop button, but before I could press it, the whispering stopped. The tape clicked, and then I heard my own voice again. "Don't look at the window." I turned off the tape. I didn't sleep that night. My apartment felt too still, too heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes made me flinch. Around 3 a.m., I noticed something. The blinds in my living room were open. I never left them open, The window was large, stretching from floor to ceiling, and at night it turned into a black mirror, reflecting the room back at me. But as I stared, I realized something wasn't right. The reflection was wrong. The furniture was the same. The layout was the same. But there was someone standing in the room. Not in my apartment. In the reflection. I couldn't make out the figure clearly. They were shadowy, their outlines soft and indistinct. But they were there, standing perfectly still in the center of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned around. Nothing. The room behind me was empty. But when I looked back at the window, the figure was closer. I ran to my bedroom and locked the door. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I snatched it up, desperate for some sense of normalcy. There was a new notification. One missed call from unknown. The voicemail was short, just static, a faint whisper, and then my voice again, distorted and crackling. Don't turn around. I didn't. I stayed in my bed until morning, my back pressed against the headboard, the cassette player still sitting on the kitchen table like a loaded gun. When the sun rose, I gathered what little courage I had left and went to the living room. The blinds were closed again. I wanted to believe it was a dream or a stress-induced hallucination, but the cassette tape was still there, the label staring back at me with that jagged handwriting. Listen, I should have thrown it away. I should have burned it, but I couldn't. Some part of me was afraid that if I tried, it would come back. Instead, I shoved it into the closet and tried to move on. But things kept changing. Doors I swore I'd locked were suddenly open. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the apartment at odd hours. And every time I passed a mirror or a reflective surface, I thought I saw something, someone, just out of frame, watching. One night, I came home to find another package on my doorstep, identical to the first. My name was scrawled across the top in that same jagged handwriting, but this time, the box was heavier. I didn't open it. It's still sitting in the corner of my apartment, untouched. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint sounds coming from inside it. Tapping, scratching, whispering. I don't listen to the tape anymore. I don't look at the windows. And I don't open packages that aren't mine. But I can feel it. Whatever's inside the box, it's waiting for me. It started when I moved into the house on Blackthorn Street. It wasn't my dream home, just an old rental with a leaky faucet and a yard full of weeds. But it was cheap and close to work. The landlord had warned me that the neighborhood was quiet, which turned out to be an understatement. The street was eerily still, the kind of place where curtains twitch if you step outside, but no one actually comes out to say hello. The first odd thing happened on my second night there. I was in the kitchen unpacking boxes when I noticed something strange. A handprint on the window above the sink. It was small, like a child's, and smeared faintly across the glass. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd touched the outside of the window while moving in. But it didn't make sense. It was too high for me to reach without a ladder. And why would a kid's handprint be there? Anyway, the yard was fenced, and I hadn't seen any children in the neighborhood. I grabbed a rag, wiped the window clean, and tried not to think about it. The next morning, it was back. Same handprint, same spot. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach tightening. This time, I left it alone. Maybe I wanted proof, or maybe I didn't want to touch it. That night, I heard the first noise. It was faint at first, just a soft scraping sound coming from the living room. Maisie, my cat, perked up immediately, her ears swiveling toward the noise. I froze, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I told myself it was the wind or an animal outside, but when I stepped into the living room, the sound stopped. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. No open windows, no sign of anything out of place. Maisie hissed at something in the corner, but when I turned the light on, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to nerves and went to bed. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was watching me. Over the next few days, the noises got worse. The scraping became louder, and I started hearing other sounds too. Footsteps creaking across the floorboards, faint whispers just on the edge of hearing. I began to dread the nights, lying in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, waiting for the house to settle into its strange, restless rhythm. Then the drawing started. It happened on a Saturday. I woke up to find the handprint still on the kitchen window, but now there were shapes around it. Rough, smeared drawings that looked like stick figures. I stared at them, my mouth dry. They hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. I took a photo on my phone, just to prove to myself I wasn't imagining things, and then I scrubbed the window clean. It didn't matter. By the next morning, they were back. That night, I dreamed about a child. She was standing in my backyard, her face pale and smudged with dirt. Her hair hung in limp strands around her shoulders, and she was wearing a torn dress that looked like it belonged to another era. She didn't speak, but I could feel her watching me. When I woke up, the drawings on the window had changed. There was another figure now, taller, standing over the smaller one. I called the landlord the next day, trying to explain what was happening without sounding insane. He listened patiently, then sighed. "I was hoping it wouldn't be a problem," he said. "What wouldn't be a problem?" I demanded. He hesitated. "Look, it's an old house. Sometimes old places hold on to things." "What things?" He cleared his throat. "Just keep the windows clean. Don't encourage it." "Encourage what?" He wouldn't say. He hung up before I could press him further. By this point, I was hardly sleeping. The noises had escalated. Knocking on the walls, the sound of something dragging across the floor, and once, a soft humming that sent chills down my spine. Maisie wouldn't go near the kitchen anymore, and even during the day, the house felt oppressive, like the air was too thick to breathe. I started to notice other changes too. My belongings weren't where I left them. Doors I knew I'd closed were open when I came back into the room. And then, one night, I found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the kitchen. Small ones, like a child's. That was the night I decided to leave. I packed a bag and booked a room at a motel across town. I didn't bother to explain why, but as I was locking the front door, I glanced back at the kitchen window and froze. The drawings were back, but this time, the tall figure wasn't just standing over the smaller one. It was crouched, its long arms stretched out, its stick-like fingers gripping the smaller figure by the shoulders. And next to it, there was a new drawing. A house. My house. I didn't sleep that night. The motel room was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left the house behind, that it had followed me somehow. The next morning, I went back to grab the rest of my things. I told myself it would be quick, just in and out, but when I opened the door, I stopped dead. The house was empty, completely empty, not just of my things, but of everything. No furniture, no curtains, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The walls were bare, the floors covered in a thin layer of dust. It was like the house had swallowed itself whole, and on the kitchen window, faint and smeared, was a single handprint. I didn't go back. I didn't ask questions. I left town that same day and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear it, the soft scraping, the faint whispers. And when I look at the windows in my new apartment, I swear I see something faint, something small, something waiting. The ad was simple. Looking for someone to help catalog personal archives. Easy work. Great pay. $200 per hour. Call now. I found it in the classifieds, buried between ads for used lawnmowers and dubious weight loss pills. The number listed didn't have a name attached, just a voicemail that said, "Thank you for your interest. If you're serious, come to 814 Wexler Avenue." Midnight. Midnight was weird, but $200 an hour was enough to make me curious. I showed up at 11:50, the air thick with summer heat, the street unervingly quiet. The house at 814 Wexler was massive, an old Victorian with peeling paint and windows that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. No lights were on, but the front door creaked open when I stepped onto the porch. "Hello?" I called, peering into the dim interior. A voice answered from the shadows, smooth, calm, and oddly formal. "You're early. Please, come in." The man who emerged was tall and gaunt, his features sharp enough to carve stone. He wore a dark suit that looked older than the house, and his hands were pale, almost translucent. "You'll be helping with my collection," he said, gesturing toward the stairs. "What kind of collection?" I asked, my voice wavering. He smiled thinly. "Memories." The stairwell led to a cavernous room that didn't match the rest of the house. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they held objects: a rusted pocket watch, a child's shoe, a cracked porcelain doll. Each item was enclosed in its own glass case, labeled with a small, handwritten card. One card read, "The Last Wish of Eleanor Pierce, 1897. Another said, "What Matthew Hargrove Never Said, 1964. I frowned, my stomach nodding. "What is this?" "Artifacts," the man said, brushing past me. "Fragments of moments, preserved before they were lost." "Lost?" I echoed. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Memories fade. Regrets fester. Time erases. My work ensures nothing truly disappears. But it's demanding. That's where you come in." He handed me a pair of gloves and pointed toward a table in the corner. On it was a box, about the size of a shoebox, sealed with red wax. "Your task is simple," he said. "Open the box, examine its contents, and describe them in detail. Every item tells a story. Write it down." I hesitated. "What's in the box?" "That's for you to discover." The man left without another word, his footsteps silent as he disappeared into the shadows. I stared at the box for a long time before sitting down and breaking the wax seal. Inside were 3 objects: a brass key, a faded photograph of a boy standing in front of a tree, and a bundle of dried flowers tied with twine. As I touched the key, a sudden wave of nausea hit me. The room blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was standing in a narrow hallway, the air thick with the smell of mildew. A door at the end of the hall was locked, the brass key trembling in my hand. I knew, somehow, that whatever was behind that door wasn't meant to be seen. I dropped the key, and the vision vanished. Heart racing, I grabbed the photograph next. This time, the vision was quieter, gentler. The boy in the picture was laughing, climbing the tree with dirt-streaked hands. But his laughter stopped abruptly, his head turning towards something just out of frame. His expression shifted from joy to fear, and then the vision ended. The flowers were the worst. The moment I touched them, I was overwhelmed by a sense of crushing grief. I was kneeling in a forest, holding the bundle of flowers while tears streamed down my face. A name echoed in my head: Emily. When I came back to myself, I was trembling, my hands slick with sweat despite the gloves. I wrote everything down, as the man had instructed, and waited for him to return. When he finally appeared, his expression was unreadable. He picked up the notes, skimming them with his long, pale fingers. "You felt them, didn't you?" he asked without looking at me. I nodded, my throat dry. "What are they?" He smiled faintly. "Echoes. Imprints left behind by lives long gone. Some are mundane. Others linger." He set the notes down and gestured to another box. This one was larger, its wax seal black instead of red. "Would you like to continue?" I wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run and never come back. But something about the house, the collection, the memories, pulled at me. I opened the next box. Inside was a broken mirror, its edges jagged and sharp. Before I could touch it, the man's hand shot out, stopping me. His grip was cold, like marble. "Not with your hands," he said, his voice low. "This one requires caution." He handed me a small, handheld mirror instead. "Hold this up when you look into it. Reflect the reflection." My pulse pounded as I did as he said, angling the handheld mirror to catch the broken one's surface. For a split second, I saw myself, tired, disheveled, scared. But then my reflection changed. It smiled. Not the nervous, uneasy smile I'd been wearing all night, but something cruel, predatory. My reflection raised a hand and waved, though I hadn't moved. And then it leaned closer, its mouth moving as if to speak. The handheld mirror shattered in my grip, and the vision was gone. The man sighed, almost regretfully. Some memories don't want to stay confined. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, shaking my head. "I can't do this. I'm done." He didn't try to stop me. "Very well," he said, his tone polite but distant. "Your payment will be sent." As I left the house, the air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. I didn't look back. That night, I tried to sleep, but the dreams wouldn't let me. I saw the boy by the tree, the flowers in the forest, and my own reflection, grinning at me from the shards of a broken mirror. When I woke up, there was a small box on my nightstand, sealed with black wax. It wasn't there before, and I swear I could hear my own voice whispering from inside, "Don't open it." I wasn't supposed to find the door. It was buried behind a rotting bookshelf in the basement, tucked into the farthest corner of the house. The kind of door you don't notice unless you're looking for it, and even then, it feels like it doesn't want to be found. The discovery wasn't intentional. I just moved into the place, a crumbling Victorian monstrosity that was somehow both too big and too small. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper with potential, which I now realized was code for a death trap held together by termites and wishful thinking. The basement was worse than the rest of the house. A damp, claustrophobic pit with cracked walls and a ceiling so low I had to crouch to move around. I'd gone down there to store some boxes and stumbled over the bookshelf while trying to find a spot for my old camping gear. It toppled with a groan, scattering decades worth of dust and cobwebs, and that's when I saw it. A small, black door, barely 4 feet tall, set flush into the wall. It had no handle, no hinges, just a smooth surface painted in a matte black that seemed to drink in the dim light. I crouched down, running my fingers over it, and found a small indentation near the center, a keyhole. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The edges of the door were sealed shut with red wax, thick and crude, like someone had smeared it on in a hurry. Pressed into the wax were faint symbols, none of which I recognized. I should have left it alone, but curiosity has always been my downfall. I spent the next few days trying to figure out the door. Google turned up nothing helpful. No mentions of hidden doors in Victorian homes, no wax seals with strange symbols. The house's previous owner had passed away years ago, and the realtor hadn't mentioned any surviving family. Then, on the 4th day, I found the key. It was in the attic, inside a small, locked chest I'd almost ignored. The chest had been stuffed in the back of a closet, hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Its lock was rusted, and I managed to pry it open with a screwdriver. Inside was the key, old and blackened, with a twisting, almost organic shape that didn't quite look man-made. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, and for a moment I hesitated. But the pull of the door was too strong. That night, I went down to the basement, key in hand. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like the walls are holding their breath. I crouched in front of the door, my heart pounding, and slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. When I turned it, the wax around the edges of the door cracked, and the symbols flared bright red before fading to ash. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest, and a low hum filled the room, vibrating deep in my bones. The door swung open. The first thing I noticed was the smell, damp earth and something metallic, like blood. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase, spiraling down into darkness. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture, and the air that wafted up was cold enough to sting my skin. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the door, sealed it back up, and pretended I'd never found it. But I didn't. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The stairs went deeper than they should have, far deeper than the basement should have allowed. I counted 50 steps, then 100, the light from the basement fading to nothing above me. The hum grew louder the farther I went, a low, thrumming sound that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a corridor. It stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls carved with more of those strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. The floor was uneven, littered with fragments of stone and rusted metal, and the air felt thick, almost syrupy. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, but it didn't reach far. The darkness seemed to swallow it, as if it were alive. That's when I saw the first door. It was identical to the one in my basement. Small, black, and featureless, with a keyhole in the center. Something about it felt wrong, though, like it didn't want to be opened. I didn't touch it. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the corridor. The hum grew louder with every step, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside my head. Then I found the second door. and the third, and the fourth. They lined the walls of the corridor, spaced irregularly, each one identical to the last. The farther I went, the more doors I found, dozens of them stretching into the distance. Some were intact, sealed shut with that same red wax. Others were broken, their seals cracked, the doors hanging ajar. I didn't want to know what was behind them, but then I heard it, a sound that wasn't the hum. It was faint at first, a soft, wet noise, like something dragging itself across stone. It came from behind one of the broken doors, its black surface pushed slightly open. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As the sound grew louder, something moved in the darkness beyond the door. It was slow at first, deliberate, as if it knew I was there. Then it lunged. I didn't see what it was. I didn't wait long enough to find out. I turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip, the hum roaring in my ears. Behind me, I heard the sound of scraping claws, the wet slap of something heavy and alive. The stairs felt longer on the way up. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop until I reached the basement. I slammed the black door shut, and the wax resealed itself instantly, the symbols flaring bright red before fading. The humming stopped. I haven't touched the door since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of claws on stone, faint and distant, like something is climbing. It was a rainy Thursday when I first noticed the apartment across the street. Not in a this is just part of the neighborhood way, I mean really noticed it. I'd lived in my unit for 2 years, and while I knew there was a building opposite mine, I never paid much attention to the details. That day, the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring everything into streaks of gray. I was working from home, half watching a webinar while sipping lukewarm coffee, when something in the window across from mine caught my eye. A figure. I wasn't the kind of person to spy on my neighbors, but something about it held my attention. The figure was still, standing in the middle of a dimly lit room, just barely visible through the curtains. They didn't move, didn't look out the window, didn't do anything except stand. I shrugged it off. People do weird things, right? Maybe they were zoning out or waiting for someone. But when I glanced back 10 minutes later, the figure was still there. That night, after my workday ended, I peeked out the window again. The room across the way was dark, but the figure was still there, barely illuminated by the orange glow of the streetlights. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks on my window, and I could see them more clearly now. It wasn't a person, at least, not entirely. It had the outline of a human, a head, shoulders, arms, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs seemed elongated, like they'd been stretched on a rack. And its face. I couldn't make out any features, just a pale, blurry blankness. My stomach knotted, and I quickly shut the blinds. The next morning, the figure was gone. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but when I opened my blinds, something in my apartment felt different. The air felt heavier, like the room was holding its breath. And then I saw it. On my kitchen table, there was a glass of water. I hadn't poured it. I lived alone, and I was sure I'd left the table empty before going to bed. The water was clear, but the glass had a smudge near the rim, as though someone had taken a drink. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the building made me jump. I kept checking the window, but the apartment across the street was dark, the curtains drawn. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following day, the glass was gone. No trace of it. I checked every corner of my apartment, but it was as if it had never been there. The figure didn't reappear that night, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then the dreams started. I dreamed of standing in a room identical to mine, except everything was reversed, like a mirror image. The furniture, the layout, even the photos on the walls. They were all there, just slightly off. And in the corner of the room stood the figure, its long limbs twisting unnaturally as it moved closer. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. My clock read 3:13 a.m., and I was paralyzed by the lingering dread of the dream. But when I sat up, I froze. My blinds were open, and the window across the street was lit up. The figure was back, but this time, it was staring directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Its head tilted to the side, as if studying me, and then it raised a hand, a long, spindly hand, and pointed. I followed its gesture, looking down at my desk. There was a note. "Do you see me now?" My heart pounded as I grabbed the note, but when I looked back up, the light across the street was off. The figure was gone. Over the next few days, I tried to avoid looking out the window. I even considered moving, but something kept me there. A morbid curiosity, a need to understand. Every night, the figure reappeared, always standing, always watching, and the notes kept coming. "You can't hide. I know you. We're the same." Each morning, I'd wake to find the notes sitting on my desk or tucked under my coffee mug. The handwriting was strange, sharp, and jagged, as though it had been scratched onto the paper rather than written. Then, one night, it was inside my apartment. I woke to the sound of something scraping against the floor. My chest tightened as I turned toward the sound. The figure was standing at the foot of my bed, its two long arms dangling at its sides. Its head tilted again, and for the first time, it spoke. "Do you see yourself?" Its voice was low and distorted, like a recording played backward. I scrambled out of bed, my back pressing against the wall, but the figure didn't move. It simply stared at me, its head twitching slightly. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "To remind you." "Of what?" I shouted. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand again, pointing toward my mirror. I turned slowly, my blood running cold as I saw my reflection. It wasn't me. The person in the mirror looked like me. Same face, same hair, but their expression was wrong. They were smiling, wide and sinister, their eyes dark and hollow. They raised a hand to wave, even though I hadn't moved. When I turned back, the figure was gone. I don't know what's real anymore. Every night, the notes appear, even when I lock my doors and windows. My reflection doesn't follow my movements. The apartment across the street is empty now, its windows boarded up, and sometimes, late at night, I see the figure standing in the mirror, watching me, waiting. When I first rented the apartment, the landlord gave me the rundown. Quiet building, respectful neighbors, and a quirky layout. The apartment itself was charming. Hardwood floors, big windows, and a spacious living area. The only odd feature was the door at the end of the hallway. "This one stays locked," the landlord had said, tapping the heavy wooden door with his knuckles. "It leads to some old storage space. Been sealed for years. You won't need to worry about it." I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Every old building has its quirks, right? Besides, the rent was cheap, and I needed a fresh start. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I spent my days unpacking, decorating, and enjoying the solitude. The building was eerily quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself I liked it that way. No noisy neighbors, no blaring music, just peace. But then, late one night, I heard it. A faint scraping sound, coming from the direction of the locked door. I froze in bed, straining to hear. It came again, soft and rhythmic, like nails dragging across wood. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding, convincing myself it was just the building settling. Old buildings make noise. It was nothing. The next morning, I inspected the door. The wood was scratched in places, but it looked old, like the marks had been there for years. Still, the sight unsettled me. The sounds became more frequent over the next few nights. Scraping, tapping, sometimes a faint thud. I tried to ignore it, stuffing earbuds in and playing white noise to drown it out. But the worst was the whispering. It started faint, barely audible through the thick wood. A soft, breathy murmur that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt wrong. Like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of the door wasn't speaking to me, but about me. I told myself I was imagining it. Stress, lack of sleep. I just moved. It was natural to feel on edge. But then things started to change. One morning, I woke up to find the door slightly ajar. Just a crack, but enough to send my stomach into free fall. I hadn't touched the door. I hadn't even tried the handle since I moved in. My landlord had been clear. It was sealed. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and pushed it shut. The heavy click of the latch sent a shiver through me. I checked the locks on my front door, triple-checking that they were secure, but the unease lingered. The next night, the whispering was louder. I could hear it clearly now, a hushed, frantic tone. It didn't stop, even when I shouted through the door, telling whoever was there to leave me alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it went silent. I stood there, breathless, ear pressed against the door. Nothing, just my own rapid breathing and the faint hum of the building's pipes. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away, tripping over my own feet, and fled to my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I was ready to call the landlord and demand answers. When he answered the phone, his voice was groggy, like I'd woken him up. "The door," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's behind it?" "Nothing," he replied, too quickly. "Someone's in there," I said. "I hear them every night. The door was open this morning. What's going on?" There was a long pause. "You're imagining things," he said finally. "Look, it's just old storage. Nobody's been in there for years. The locks are secure. You're fine." He hung up before I could argue. That night, the whispering stopped, but the scratching came back with a vengeance. It was louder now, frantic and desperate. I shoved a chair against the door and tried to convince myself it would hold. When I woke up, the chair was across the room. I stared at it, my stomach sinking. I hadn't moved it. The door was still closed, but now there was something new. A single word, scratched into the wood. Help. I didn't stay in the apartment that day. I grabbed my laptop and camped out at a nearby coffee shop, trying to distract myself. But no matter how much I tried, my thoughts kept drifting back to the door, to the whispers, to the scratches. By the time I returned home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the hallway. The air felt heavier as I approached the door, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Another word had been scratched into the wood. Listen. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox I'd barely unpacked and approached the door. If the landlord wasn't going to help, I'd figure out what was behind it myself. The first swing cracked the wood. The second sent splinters flying. The door gave way with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the building. The air was freezing, sharp with the smell of damp and rot. My phone flashlight barely penetrated the darkness as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. The walls were lined with scratches, like someone had clawed at them desperately. At the bottom of the stairs was a small, windowless room. In the center was a chair, and on the chair sat a figure. No, not a figure. A mannequin. It was old, its paint peeling, its features eerily human. A wig of tangled black hair sat atop its head, and its glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I approached. In its lap was a piece of paper, folded neatly. My hands trembled as I picked it up and unfolded it. The message was simple. "She's free now. Run." The whispering started again, this time all around me. I didn't look back as I sprinted up the stairs and out of the apartment. I didn't stop running until I was 3 blocks away, gasping for air. I never went back to the apartment. I called the landlord the next day to break my lease, but the number had been disconnected. When I drove by the building, it looked different, older, more decrepit, like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again. They always start with 3 knocks. I'm a paramedic, and I've seen things, horrible things, but nothing ever stuck with me the way that call from 3 years ago did. I still wake up some nights thinking about it, the sound of that voice crackling through the radio like it's happening all over again. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., when the dispatch came in. A single-car accident on Old Willow Road. That stretch of road wasn't in the best shape. Potholes, overgrown brush, but it was usually deserted at that time of night. The caller hadn't said much, just that there'd been a crash and someone was hurt. They'd sounded off, like they were trying to speak but couldn't quite get the words out. My partner, Kim, was behind the wheel as we sped out of the station. The night was cold and foggy, and the lights from the ambulance seemed to vanish into the mist. "Old Willow?" she said, frowning at the GPS. "Why does it always have to be the creepy places?" I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably some drunk who hit a tree. Easy call." We reached the scene in about 15 minutes. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No sound of crickets, no rustling of leaves. Just silence, heavy and oppressive. Our headlights illuminated the wreck. An old sedan crumpled against a massive oak tree. Steam rose from the hood, and the driver's side door hung open like a gaping wound. Kim killed the engine, and we grabbed our gear. "Hello," she called out as we approached the car. "EMS, is anyone here?" No answer. I shone my flashlight into the car. The interior was a mess, shattered glass, an airbag that had deployed, and blood. A lot of it. The driver's seat was soaked, and there was a smear of it on the steering wheel, as if someone had tried to pull themselves out. "Where the hell is the driver?" Kim muttered, scanning the area with her flashlight. The beam cut through the fog, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I bent down to examine the ground near the car. The grass was flattened, leading into the woods. "Looks like they wandered off," I said, nodding toward the trail. "Maybe they're in shock." Kim sighed. "Great. Let's find them before they bleed out." We followed the trail, our boots crunching softly on the damp earth. The farther we went, the more the trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The blood trail was sporadic, drops here, a handprint there, but it was enough to keep us moving. Then we heard it, a voice, faint and shaky, calling for help. "Over there," Kim said, pointing her flashlight toward the sound. We picked up our pace, the voice growing louder as we approached. "Help me," it said, over and over, the words trembling like they were being forced out. But something about it didn't sit right with me. It sounded wrong, hollow, like a recording played over a cheap speaker. We broke through the trees into a small clearing. The blood trail ended abruptly, pooling in the dirt, but there was no one there. Just a single, dark shoe lying on its side. Kim crouched down to inspect the shoe. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Where the hell did they go?" That's when the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." It was coming from behind us. We spun around, but the woods were empty. The fog seemed thicker now, clinging to the trees like cobwebs. The voice called out again, this time from deeper in the woods. "Help me." "We should call for backup," I said, my throat dry. Kim nodded, reaching for her radio. She pressed the button, but all that came through was static. She tried again, but it was the same. "No signal," she said, her voice tight. The voice called again, closer now. It was wrong, all wrong. It wasn't just repeating the same words. It was repeating them the exact same way. The same intonation, the same pauses. Like a recording. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing Kim's arm. "Now." Before she could respond, the flashlight in my hand flickered, then went out. The darkness was immediate and absolute, swallowing everything. I heard Kim swear under her breath as she fumbled with her flashlight, but hers wouldn't turn on either. And then, from the direction of the car, we heard footsteps. They weren't hurried or panicked. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly on the forest floor. I held my breath, straining to see through the darkness. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then, a figure stepped into the clearing. I wish I could tell you what it looked like, but the truth is, I don't know. It was tall, too tall, and its shape was indistinct, like it was made of shadows and fog. Its presence felt wrong in a way I can't explain, like it didn't belong in this world. It moved toward us, its form shifting with every step. The voice came again, this time from the figure itself. "Help me?" But it didn't sound like a plea anymore. It sounded like a command. Kim grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward the direction we'd come. "Run," she hissed. We ran. I don't know how we found our way back to the car in the dark, but we did. The fog seemed to part just enough to guide us, and when we finally burst out of the trees, the sight of the ambulance felt like salvation. We didn't look back. Kim jumped into the driver's seat and fired up the engine, and we peeled out of there as fast as the truck could go. When we got back to the station, We told our supervisor what happened. He stared at us for a long moment before finally saying, "Old Willow, you're not the first to report something out there." We filed our report, but nothing came of it. The next day, I looked up the accident in the local news. They found the car but no driver. Just an empty shoe lying in the woods. I don't take night calls anymore, and I never drive on Old Willow Road. Sometimes, though, I think about the figure in the clearing, the way it moved, the way it called out, and I wonder if it was waiting for someone else, or if it's still waiting for me. The day the clock stopped, the world didn't fall into chaos. Not immediately, anyway. At first, people treated it like a glitch, a weird phenomenon for the news to chew on. Smartphones, wall clocks, even the ancient grandfather clocks that hadn't ticked in decades, all frozen at exactly 2:47 p.m. It happened as I was walking out of my office building, the city buzzing with its usual rhythm. I glanced at my watch, then at the towering clock on the plaza. Both dead still. Around me, people murmured, checking their phones, tapping screens like that would fix whatever had gone wrong. But it wasn't just the clocks. A man chasing a cab stopped mid-stride, his briefcase slipping from his hand. A street performer's juggling pins hung motionless in the air. Even the pigeons froze mid-flap. It was as if the city had taken a collective breath and forgotten to exhale. I reached out to touch one of the juggling pins. My fingers brushed it, and it fell to the ground with a dull thunk. That's when I realized something. I was still moving. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. No one answered. I wandered for what felt like hours, or maybe minutes. Time was meaningless now, through a city suspended in limbo. I saw a cyclist frozen mid-pedal, a waitress holding a tray of drinks that didn't spill, and a man on his phone, his expression frozen in a laugh. I wasn't alone for long. I found her sitting on a bench in the park, flipping through a book as if nothing unusual was happening. Her hair was silver, her eyes a shade of blue so pale they seemed almost translucent. She glanced up as I approached, her expression mildly curious, like she'd been expecting me. "You're late," she said. "Late for what?" She closed the book with a soft snap and gestured to the empty spot on the bench. I hesitated, then sat. "You're one of them," she said, as if that explained everything. "One of who?" "The movers. Those who can walk between moments when the world pauses." I blinked at her. "I don't understand. What's happening?" She tilted her head, studying me. "Think of time as a river. Most people flow along its currents, carried from one moment to the next. But every so often, someone steps out of the water. They become a mover." "Why me?" She shrugged. "Why anyone? The river doesn't choose. It just happens." Her nonchalance was maddening. "So, what now? Do I just live like this? Alone?" She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be reassuring. "Not exactly. There's a reason the river stopped today. Something's wrong." The air around us shifted, a low hum building in the distance. She stood, slipping the book into a bag slung over her shoulder. "Come with me. You'll want to see this." We walked through the frozen park, past joggers and dog walkers suspended like statues. As we moved, the hum grew louder, more insistent, until it vibrated in my bones. We stopped at the edge of a lake. The water, like everything else, was still, a perfect mirror reflecting the overcast sky. But at its center, the surface was fractured, rippling unnaturally, as though something underneath was trying to break free. "What is that?" I asked. "The reason the clock stopped," she said. "A rift." Before I could ask more, the ripples surged, and a shape began to rise from the water. It was impossible to describe, a shifting, amorphous mass of light and shadow, constantly changing form. It pulsed with a rhythm that felt alive, a heartbeat that matched the one in my chest. The woman didn't flinch. "It's an echo," she said, "a fragment of something trying to rewrite the river." "Rewrite? What does that mean?" She turned to me, her expression finally serious. "Time isn't just a straight line. It's fragile. Sometimes, things, people, events, try to change the flow. When that happens, it creates echoes. And if they're not stopped, they shatter the river completely." Panic bubbled in my chest. "How do we stop it?" Her smile returned, faint and knowing. You're the mover. It's your choice. The echo loomed larger, its pulsating light growing blinding. Memories flooded my mind. My childhood home, the first time I fell in love, the mistakes I'd made and the victories I'd clung to. The echo wasn't just an abstract force, it was personal. I stepped toward the lake, drawn by a pull I couldn't resist. As I did, the woman's voice called out behind me. Remember, whatever you change comes at a cost. The echo's glow consumed me, and suddenly I was somewhere else. I was 12 again, standing in my parents' kitchen, the air heavy with the scent of burnt toast. My father was there, alive, smiling, handing me a plate of pancakes. My throat tightened. Dad? He looked at me like I was crazy. Who else would it be? Tears blurred my vision. I knew what this was, a chance to rewrite the past, to keep him from the accident that took him too soon. But then I heard her voice again, faint and distant. A cost. The kitchen wavered, the edges of the scene fraying like an old photograph. My father's smile faltered, his form flickering. If I chose to change this moment, what would it cost? A future memory? Someone else's happiness? I closed my eyes, my heart aching, and whispered, I can't. The world shattered around me, and I was back by the lake, gasping for air. The echo was gone, the water calm once more. The woman stood beside me, her expression unreadable. You made the right choice. I wasn't sure I believed her, but the clocks began ticking again, their steady rhythm filling the silence. As the world woke up around us, I turned to her. What now? She handed me her book, the cover blank. Now, you keep moving. And just like that, she was gone. It was supposed to be an ordinary grocery run, the kind where you grab a basket, drift through the aisles on autopilot, and walk out wondering why you forgot the one thing you actually came for. I'd been to the same store 100 times. It wasn't anything special, just a chain supermarket tucked between a dry cleaner and a pizza joint. But that night, something felt different. It was subtle at first. The fluorescent lights hummed louder than usual, a faint but persistent buzz that seemed to vibrate in my chest. The air smelled faintly of something chemical, almost like bleach, though I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I grabbed a basket and pushed the uneasy feeling aside. I was tired, that's all. The first real sign that something was wrong came in the produce section. I reached for a bag of apples, and my fingers brushed against something cold and slick. Pulling my hand back, I found the bag was soaking wet, beads of water dripping onto the floor. The other bags on the shelf were dry. Just this one, glistening like it had been dunked in a sink moments before. I set it down and moved on, trying not to think about it. Next, I headed for the cereal aisle. Halfway down, I passed an older woman wearing a bright red scarf. She was standing completely still, staring at a box of cornflakes like it held the secrets of the universe. Her head turned slightly as I walked by, and for a split second, our eyes met. Her pupils were tiny pinpricks, like she'd been staring at the sun. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I mumbled an awkward apology and moved on, suddenly eager to finish up and leave. But then I saw her again. The same woman, same red scarf, standing in the bread aisle. She was holding a loaf of sourdough now, her head tilted at the exact same angle, her lips still moving soundlessly. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. I just passed her in the cereal aisle. There was no way she could have gotten here before me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond, didn't even look at me. Her lips kept moving, forming words I couldn't hear, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I backed away slowly, my skin crawling. By the time I reached the dairy section, I was in full-blown panic mode. Something was wrong with this place, and I needed to leave. I grabbed a carton of milk without even checking the date and turned toward the registers. That's when I noticed the shelves had changed. The bread aisle was gone, replaced by a row of freezers I hadn't seen before. The cereal aisle now had rows of cleaning supplies, bottles of bleach and window cleaner stacked neatly in place of the Cheerios and Frosted Flakes. The layout of the store didn't make sense anymore. It was like someone had picked it up and shuffled the aisles like a deck of cards. I turned in circles, trying to get my bearings. but nothing looked familiar. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, the sound like static in my ears. I caught a glimpse of the woman in the red scarf again, standing at the end of an aisle, but when I blinked, she was gone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty store. "Is anyone here?" No answer. The hum of the lights seemed to pulse in response, growing louder and louder until I thought my head might split open. Then the intercom crackled to life. It didn't start with the usual ding or chime, just a low, distorted static that built into a garbled voice. I couldn't make out the words at first, but as I strained to listen, they became clearer. "Clean up on aisle 7. Clean up on aisle 7. The voice was wrong. It didn't sound human, more like a machine trying to mimic speech but failing miserably. I wasn't sure what compelled me, but I started walking. 7. That was the pet food aisle, right? Or had it been something else? The numbers on the signs above the aisles were gone now, leaving only blank, featureless panels. When I reached what I thought might be aisle 7, the temperature dropped. My breath misted in front of me, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. The shelves were empty, the floor spotless except for a single, dark stain in the center of the aisle. It looked like spilled motor oil, slick and shimmering under the harsh lights. I didn't want to get closer, but my legs carried me forward anyway, as if pulled by invisible strings. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thrum with energy. The stain wasn't just a stain. It was moving, rippling, like the surface of a pond disturbed by the wind. And then something reached out of it. A hand, or something that looked like a hand, emerged from the blackness. Its fingers were impossibly long, the skin a pale, translucent gray that seemed to glow faintly. It stretched upward, grasping at the air, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. "Clean up," the voice on the intercom repeated, more insistent now. "Clean up, clean up." The hand twisted, turning toward me, and another followed, then another, until the black stain was teeming with writhing limbs, all clawing their way toward the surface. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I burst through the front doors, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, my ears still ringing with the hum of the lights and the distorted voice. When I finally looked back, the store was dark, empty. The windows reflected nothing but my own terrified face. I didn't go back. Couldn't. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum of fluorescent lights in the distance. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the woman in the red scarf, her lips moving silently as she stares at something only she can see.